Alright, hello fellow sapiens, sit back, relax, and prepare to meet your ancestors. This is Sleepless Homo, soft science, slow storytelling, and calm curiosity for tired minds that still want to understand where we came from. We're not here to shout facts or chase trends, just to wander through deep time together, quietly. Now imagine this. The strongest humans who ever lived were not superheroes, not future transhumans or athletes sculpted in labs, but ordinary people who walked this earth roughly 50,000 years ago. They had no iron, no engines, no cities. Yet, in every measurable sense of the body, they were closer to the edge of human physical perfection than any of us today. Their bones carried the story, thicker, heavier, denser, adapted to a life of relentless movement. If you or I had stood beside one, we might have looked unfinished. Archaeologists first began to notice this pattern not through dramatic discoveries, but through quiet measurements. Fossil femurs from Ice Age shelters like Cro-Magnon, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒, and Dolní Věstonice were almost uncomfortably large, even by modern standards. The cross-sections of these leg bones tell us they endured forces we can scarcely imagine: constant walking, running, squatting, carrying. The average limb of a late Pleistocene hunter had a cortical thickness that would make a modern weightlifter blush. Their shoulders were broad, their muscle attachment sites pronounced, and their spinal columns robust enough to absorb decades of strain without the collapse that so easily visits us in middle age. These were not primitive people. They were specialists in the art of surviving the Pleistocene. The question that still echoes in laboratories today is, what did strength mean then? Because it was not the gym kind. It was the endurance kind, the slow grind of persistence hunting, of carrying a carcass across frozen tundra, of hauling water and fuel every day of one's life. When we measure these bones, we find not just power but efficiency. They were lean engines adapted to a planet still in its ice age, when energy spent was the difference between eating and dying. At roughly 50,000 years before the present, the global climate was oscillating between bitter cold and temporary relief. Much of Eurasia was open steppe, a world of mammoths and giant bison, of sparse forests and long migrations. In such a landscape, evolution favoured the body that could move, and move far. Oxygen uptake studies on comparative bone density suggest that the typical Upper Paleolithic adult burned several times the daily energy of a sedentary modern human. To live then meant to constantly transform food into motion. Fat was stored not around the waist, but in the muscles themselves, a living battery pack for survival. There's something almost reverent in how archaeologists handle these bones. They are heavy. When lifted, the weight surprises you, as though gravity meant more to them than to us. Some femora from sites in Eastern Europe could belong to individuals who, by modern athletic standards, would rival professional marathoners or decathletes. Yet these people never trained. Their training was the world itself. They didn't run for leisure. They ran because something was chasing them, or because something had to be caught. And yet, strength is never just anatomy. The mechanical forces that shape their skeletons tell a second story, about how they lived together. Dense bones imply repeated stress, but the pattern of that stress shows division of labour. Certain tasks done by men and women alike, repetitive loads suggesting shared endurance rather than hierarchical work. In many sites, female skeletons show similar limb robusticity to males, an indicator that physical demands were nearly universal. In this sense, peak human was not just a body, it was a lifestyle of unending cooperation with landscape, weather, and each other. You might imagine a group moving slowly across a valley in what is now France or Central Asia. Their skin glows in the low sunlight, their muscles taut under fur and smoke. Every movement has purpose, every calorie must justify itself. When anthropologists reconstruct their daily distance travelled, it exceeds anything we would willingly endure, perhaps 20 or 30 kilometres per day, every day, sometimes more. They carried their homes on their backs, their tools at their waists, and their future children in their arms. When forensic teams run CT scans of their bones, what they find is astounding. Dense trabecular networks, like intricate honeycombs, stronger and more interlocked than those of almost any later population. To put it simply, their skeletons were built to resist collapse. Our own bones, softened by agriculture and chairs, have become lighter, a trend visible even in the last few thousand years. In one sense, evolution continued to work, but it selected for flexibility, not fortitude. The humans of 50,000 years ago, however, lived in a world where flexibility came second to sheer survival power. They stood slightly shorter on average, often around 160 to 170 centimetres, but their mass and muscle made them look broader, more grounded. Their faces too reflected their reality. Wide nasal openings for cold air, heavy jaws for chewing tough meat, and deep skull vaults housing brains that, on average, were larger than ours. Not smarter in the way we measure intelligence today, but built for raw sensory processing. Sharper vision in twilight, perhaps quicker reactions to motion, a nervous system tuned for survival signals. What we call peak human was not only physical but environmental. The glaciers and steppes of that era formed a living gymnasium of endurance. Imagine breathing air colder and thinner than any you've known, walking across plains where food was uncertain, where every muscle twitch mattered. In that sense, their world sculpted them. They didn't choose strength, the planet demanded it. This raises a quiet paradox. In evolutionary terms, they were incredibly fit for their niche, but that niche was collapsing beneath them. Their physiology was a masterpiece tuned to a world that was already changing. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The decline belongs to later. For now, it's enough to marvel that the human frame could reach such efficient precision under such harsh laws. The way we reconstruct their musculature has changed dramatically in the last few decades. Instead of speculative drawings, we now use 3D modelling based on bone geometry. When a muscle pulls on bone, it leaves a mark, a ridge, a depression, a flare. By measuring those traces, researchers can estimate muscle mass and mechanical advantage. What emerges from this data is a picture of a species at its athletic apex. A single step from these humans would generate ground forces higher than ours, their tendons thicker, their joints less prone to dislocation. Even their heel bones, the calcaneae, were elongated to store elastic energy for long-distance walking. We often picture prehistory as fragile and uncertain, but it's humbling to realise how much raw vitality these people carried. Their daily caloric intake may have reached 4,000 or 5,000 calories, and still many were lean. Their heart rates likely ran low and steady, their lungs enormous from a lifetime of motion. They were not the weary figures of modern imagination, trudging through hardship. They were the peak expression of what Homo sapiens could be, when life itself was the training ground. Of course, bones can tell us only so much. The rest, the smell of smoke on their skin, the calluses on their hands, the rhythm of their footsteps in snow, is inference, careful imagination guided by evidence. But even within those limits, the data are clear. Around 50,000 years ago, humans embodied a kind of perfection that evolution rarely sustains. What fascinates scientists most is that this physical optimization happened before civilization, before tools or architecture could compensate for weakness. This means it wasn't technology that made them strong. it was the absence of it. Without wheels, without domestic animals, without stored food, the body itself became the technology. Every adaptation we now outsource to machines or institutions was once biological. Warmth came from muscle and fat. Speed came from legs. Memory came from the group. In this way, our ancestors were closer to nature's edge, not apart from it, but embedded within it. Modern humans still carry echoes of that legacy. Genetic variants associated with endurance, fat metabolism, and bone density remain scattered in our genomes, like faint footprints on a trail long buried. When ultramarathoners run in low oxygen conditions, or Arctic explorers march through storms, they awaken something ancient in our physiology. A whisper from those long-gone bodies reminding us that we were once built for this. And yet, no reconstruction can fully answer what it felt like to be them. To wake before dawn and stretch muscles that never atrophied, to feel hunger as a constant companion, to know the terrain not through maps but through muscle memory. If you could somehow trade bodies with one of them, you might feel invincible for a few days, until you realized what that body demanded in return. Its power required motion. Stillness would have been unbearable. In museums today, their bones rest in glass cases under soft light. Visitors stare at the skulls of Cro-Magnon men and women, trying to imagine the life behind those faces. It's tempting to think of them as our equals, perhaps even our superiors in stamina. But strength alone does not measure success. Evolution does not reward the strongest. It rewards the most adaptable. The robust limbs that once defined the human ideal were the result of a contract with an unforgiving planet. A contract that could not last forever. So when we speak of peak human, we're not glorifying an era of violence or hardship. We're acknowledging the astonishing resilience of a species that moulded itself, literally, to the cold. Their skeletons remind us that survival once had a weight, a physical cost we no longer pay. The paradox is that their perfection was temporary. They stood at the top of a narrow mountain of adaptation, looking out across a world soon to melt and shift beneath their feet. For now, their story ends not in decline but in admiration. The bones in our museums, the data in our journals, and the quiet reverence in the archaeologist's hand all tell us one thing. Humanity has not always been frail, or distracted, or dependent. Once, we were carved by the earth itself into forms of endurance so complete that nature could not improve upon them. Perhaps that is why they disappeared. Perfection is rarely sustainable. And maybe that's the lesson. That strength, however beautiful, is never the end of the story. It is only the beginning of change. If you enjoy these long, factual journeys, the archaeology of being itself, consider subscribing. It helps other sleepless humans find a little calm education in the dark. Tell me, where do you listen from? While falling asleep, working late, or driving through the night? However you join, I'm glad you're here. And if you drift off somewhere along the way, you'll find timestamps below, so you can always return to the part you dreamed through. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now, what if I told you that every bone you've ever seen in a museum, bleached, silent, stripped of flesh and story, is still alive in one sense? Each ridge and curve, each subtle swelling of the femur or groove in a tooth is a kind of language. Not one we hear, but one we measure, decode and translate into movement. Bones whisper what their owners once did, how they walked, what they carried, even how they chewed. Around 48,000 years ago, the skeletons of upper Paleolithic humans began telling us something extraordinary. We were once built differently. Not mythically, not superhumanly, but anatomically. The design of our bodies, our blueprints, was heavier, thicker, and in many ways more efficient for the life the planet demanded. Archaeologists don't just look at skeletons, they study proportions like engineers inspecting the remains of an ancient machine. The ratio between the upper arm and forearm, the length of the femur compared to the tibia. These small relationships are blueprints of adaptation. In populations from Europe, Asia and North Africa, dated between 50 and 30,000 years before the present, the human body reads like a cold weather manual. Shorter distal limbs meant less heat loss, larger joint surfaces spread the strain of heavy loads, and thick cortical bone distributed impact forces evenly. Every centimetre of the body's design reflected daily physical demands that most of us would not survive a week of. Take the humerus, the upper arm bone. In specimens from sites such as Pavlov in modern-day Czechia or Sunghyr in Russia, the cross-sectional geometry reveals torsional strength beyond that of almost any modern athlete. These people use their arms as tools of survival, for throwing, cutting, hauling. Their bones twisted and remodelled in response to decades of effort, constantly reshaping themselves under stress. A modern arm placed under the same load would fracture where theirs simply thickened. Even their elbows tell a story. Wide, robust condyles for stabilizing repeated strain. These were bodies that had solved the problem of endurance long before sports science gave it a name. Move lower down the skeleton, and the legs begin to speak even louder. The femora of upper Paleolithic humans were curved like the drawn bows they once held. Not straight rods, but flexible levers designed for movement. The shafts were thick, the heads large, the knee joints reinforced by dense trabecular networks that distributed shock through the entire bone rather than letting it shatter. To put it simply, walking for them was not exercise, it was physics. The geometry of their skeleton was tuned to turn motion into survival. When scientists run finite element models, virtual stress tests, on these ancient bones, they find something remarkable. The mechanical efficiency of those legs, the balance between bone mass and muscle force, was near optimal for long-distance movement under heavy load. In evolutionary terms, it was elegance born of necessity. Compared with our lighter modern frames, their skeletons carried roughly 30 to 40% more bone mass. That means their every step was heavier, but it also means their bodies were stronger engines for it. Even their skulls differ, not in the cartoonish sense of jutting brows and wild eyes, but in subtle architecture. The cranial vaults of upper Paleolithic humans were large, rounded and thick-walled, protecting brains that were, on average, slightly larger than ours. Again, this doesn't mean smarter in our sense of abstraction or language. It means more processing space for vision, coordination, and sensor-motor control. A world that required constant awareness of terrain, prey, and weather-sculpted brains that had to process 1,000 inputs per second just to stay alive. The skull reflects this. The occipital bun at the back of the head anchors massive neck muscles. The broad nasal aperture warms freezing air. The teeth are worn flat from lifelong chewing of sinew and unrefined grain. Dental remains, though small, are some of the most eloquent. A tooth is a lifetime diary written in enamel. Microscopic striations on Paleolithic teeth show diets dominated by tough meat, fibrous roots, and occasional nuts or seeds. Their jaws, wide and square, show stress patterns from continuous chewing, the kind of work that remodels facial bone itself. In many skeletons, scientists note that the mandible is thicker and more projecting than ours, built to absorb impact without fracture. The act of eating itself was an athletic event, one repeated thousands of times across a lifetime until the enamel wore smooth like river stones. The isotopes locked inside those teeth and bones tell us what the eye cannot. Carbon and nitrogen signatures reveal a diet astonishingly high in protein, in some cases rivaling that of modern Arctic hunters. These values suggest that the energy for those powerful frames came not from grain or sugar, but from a direct relationship with the animals of the steppe. In oxygen isotopes, we can even read their movements, subtle variations that trace seasonal migration patterns between warmer valleys and frozen uplands. Each skeleton becomes a map, each tooth a calendar of survival. To compare them with us is almost unfair. Our bones are lighter, our muscles weaker relative to size, our teeth smaller and more gracile. We've traded density for adaptability, structure for flexibility. But those early Upper Paleolithic humans did not need flexibility in our sense. Their world was stable in its harshness. It demanded strength, not change. They carried their resilience in their skeletons the way we carry it now in our technology. One of the most striking findings comes from biomechanics, how energy travels through bone. When a force hits a structure, it either dissipates or fractures it. The ancient skeletons, when modelled, reveal distribution patterns that suggest an incredible harmony between muscle and bone. Their bone thickness wasn't wasteful. It was perfectly proportioned to the stresses they endured. Even their feet tell the tale, broad metatarsals with curved arches adapted for long treks over uneven terrain. They were walkers by evolution, not by choice. If we could see them alive, standing beside us, the differences might be subtle but undeniable. Broader chests, heavier forearms, perhaps a slight stoop from years of carrying weight. Their faces would show wide cheekbones, deep-set eyes, and a quiet steadiness, a body language tuned to endurance. The modern human might appear delicate in comparison, our bones half their thickness, our posture shaped more by chairs than by landscape. Yet, looking at them, we would still recognise ourselves. Same eyes, same curiosity, same capacity for thought. The blueprints changed slowly, but they changed all the same. What these bones also reveal is how different our relationship with movement has become. For them, motion was existence. For us, it is optional. Their skeletal adaptation shows continuous remodelling, bone tissue breaking down and rebuilding through mechanical stress. Ours shows decline, a quiet softening from lack of use. The most humbling discovery of modern anthropology might be that we are the first humans in history who can survive without using the full potential of our bodies. We can sit, and the world comes to us. They could not. Even within the Upper Paleolithic, variation existed. Some populations were more graceful than others, depending on latitude, diet, and local terrain. Those from colder northern climates, such as Eastern Europe and Siberia, tend to have thicker bones and shorter limbs, while those closer to the equator tend to have thinner bones and longer limbs. Mediterraneans show taller, leaner builds. This diversity reminds us that peak human was not a single mould but a spectrum of specializations, each shaped by its landscape. Yet across all of them, one theme persists: no sign of skeletal frailty. Even the elderly show robustness we would envy today. Osteoporosis, so common in modern populations, is nearly absent. Their bones aged, but they did not weaken easily. For physical anthropologists, the excitement lies not only in the bones themselves, but in what they imply about living tissue now lost to time. Muscle, tendon, cartilage, none of it survives, yet its imprint remains. The points where muscles anchored tell us their size and strength. The radius of the deltoid tuberosity on the humerus, the flare of the iliac crest on the pelvis, the ridges on the femoral shaft. Each is a signature of muscle architecture. Reconstructing these details turns skeletons into living beings again, not static artifacts. Through biomechanics, researchers estimate that a Paleolithic adult's grip strength was roughly double that of the average modern human. Their back muscles supported daily bending, lifting and twisting, movements our bodies now resist. It is tempting to romanticize them, but science insists on restraint. Not every robust skeleton belonged to a healthy or happy individual. Many show healed fractures, joint wear, and spinal compression, the costs of such a demanding life. Yet even those injuries testify to resilience, bone regrowth, adaptation, survival after trauma. These were not fragile people living on the edge of extinction. They were adaptable in their own way, physically responsive, constantly repairing and renewing. The material of their bones was denser, but so was the rhythm of their lives. One could say that bones are honest historians. They record truth without metaphor. And what they tell us about 48,000 years ago is not a story of savagery or simplicity, but of specialization. A species tuned, through countless generations, to its environment with surgical precision. These people did not think about fitness. They embodied it. Their skeletons were the final version of a long-running experiment, how far the human form could go under the rule of nature alone. Today, when we look at the data, the measurements, the isotope ratios, the computer models, we realize that what vanished was not just a population but a way of being human, a kind of biological craftsmanship where every bone was the memory of labor. Modern skeletons no longer carry that memory. We are lighter because the world carries more for us. Still, even as we study them with lasers and algorithms, a quiet humility lingers. We do not fully know what it meant to inhabit such a body, how it felt to move, to breathe in air so cold it burned the lungs, to feel muscle and bone working as one seamless instrument. The science gives us outlines, blueprints, fragments of truth, but the full picture belongs to the people themselves, long gone, whose bones still lie in the earth, whispering that perfection once had weight. Imagine standing in a world where the horizon itself feels cold. The air burns your lungs, not because of smoke or pollution, but because it is too clean, too thin, and too sharp. The ground beneath your feet is hard as stone, crusted with ice that never fully melts even in summer. Around you, the wind never stops moving, sweeping through open plains the size of continents. This was Earth around 50,000 years ago, a planet locked in the late Pleistocene, sculpted by ice and silence. It was a world that did not welcome life easily. Everything that survived had to earn its place, and nothing embodied that survival more fully than the human body itself. To understand the strength of our Ice Age ancestors, you have to imagine the planet they lived on not as we see it today, but as a single global experiment in endurance. At its height, the ice sheets reached as far south as northern France and northern China. Massive glaciers buried mountain ranges, grinding stone into powder. Sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today, exposing entire land bridges where water now lies. Much of the world's moisture was locked away as ice, leaving the mid-latitudes dry, treeless, and brutally exposed. It was not just a cold world. It was a high-pressure system of scarcity, where every calorie and breath had to be fought for. Oxygen itself was in shorter supply, not globally, but locally, as atmospheric circulation changed under glacial conditions. The air held more dust and less humidity, making each breath denser, harsher, and more taxing. Archaeological isotopes from ancient soils show that carbon dioxide levels were roughly half of what they are today, meaning photosynthesis struggled and vegetation was limited. Grasslands stretched endlessly, but they were thinly productive, a blanket of hardy sedges, mosses and frost-resistant grasses that could survive months of darkness. Forests were retreating to refuges near coasts and rivers. The great central plains of Eurasia became a biological desert, punctuated only by the movement of immense herds. It was within this near hostile equilibrium that the bodies of late Pleistocene humans took shape. Their chests broadened not out of choice, but from generations of life in an environment that demanded more air per breath. Their blood carried more hemoglobin, their metabolism ran hot even at rest, and their muscles acted as furnaces that never fully cooled. These weren't cosmetic changes, they were survival itself. A world of ice sculpts not through comfort, but through resistance. The steppe tundra, as scientists call it, was one of the most unusual ecosystems ever to exist. It was simultaneously barren and alive, treeless but crowded with animals. The cold trapped nutrients close to the ground, creating a paradoxical abundance of grazing mammals. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, steppe bison, reindeer, wild horses, and even lions and hyenas all shared this vast grassland. But abundance does not mean ease. Winters could last 9 months, and temperatures could plunge below what even Arctic species tolerate today. In such cycles, death was routine. Life here was not about thriving, it was about continuing. For humans, this environment became an evolutionary sculptor. Every step across the tundra was an act of adaptation. Skin had to retain heat without losing flexibility. Hands needed to grip tools in sub-zero winds. Eyes had to adjust to snow glare, and fat distribution became an issue of survival rather than beauty. Those with slightly thicker skin or better circulation stood a better chance. Over generations, these minute advantages shaped entire populations. They became stockier, broader, and built for warmth retention. What we see in the fossil record is not coincidence, it's feedback. The world forced our physiology into its own image. Glaciologists and paleoclimatologists can now reconstruct this environment with surprising precision. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica trap tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere, each one a time capsule of the climate that sculpted them. The layers tell of dust storms that lasted years, of volcanic winters, and of long, grinding cold spells interrupted only briefly by warming periods. During one such interstadial, a short, mild interval within the Ice Age, the plains of Eurasia bloomed just long enough for humans and animals to expand, only to be snapped back by cold a few centuries later. In this stop-start rhythm of survival, evolution had little patience for fragility. When we look at bones and muscle attachments from this period, we see the imprint of that constant environmental stress. Larger lung capacity meant broader rib cages, heavy workloads meant dense bone structure. Even the sinuses expanded, warming and moistening air before it reached the lungs. Small compact noses may look aesthetic in modern fashion, but during the Pleistocene, wide nasal passages were the mark of survival, allowing air to heat as it entered the body. Every surface of the human form became a compromise between conserving heat and staying mobile. The Ice Age also demanded resilience at the metabolic level. Fat was currency, an internal energy reserve that could mean the difference between surviving a bad winter or not. Unlike most animals that stored fat seasonally, humans learned to regulate it through constant metabolic flexibility. The body switched between burning fat and protein depending on the availability of food, creating a physiology of endurance rather than specialization. To live through such cycles, your body had to be able to starve slowly. Imagine those endless plains again, wind slicing across open ground, light refracting off frozen crystals, herds of mammoth trudging through knee-deep snow. For humans, every hunt required calculation, not just of prey, but of energy. How many calories will it take to find food? How many will we burn just by breathing in this cold? In such a world, nothing could be wasted. Not movement, not warmth, not flesh. The body that survived was the one that could turn scarcity into equilibrium. In permafrost cores and loess deposits, ancient wind-blown sediments, scientists find evidence of pollen from cold-resistant plants like artemisia and dwarf willow. These hardy species tell us the steppe tundra wasn't a featureless wasteland, but a mosaic of grassland patches and frost-shattered soil. During summer, the landscape burst briefly into colour. Purples, yellows and greens as flowers emerged for a few weeks of pollination frenzy. It was likely the only time of year when humans saw abundance. Then autumn arrived, and the cycle of deprivation began again. The Ice Age was not equally harsh everywhere. In Africa and parts of southern Asia, conditions fluctuated differently, with alternating wet and dry phases. But for the populations living between what is now Western Europe and Siberia, the challenge was constant cold. River valleys carved deep into frozen ground served as corridors of life. There, groundwater could remain unfrozen, and animals gathered for warmth and drink. The humans who followed them had to memorize every curve of those valleys, every frozen stream crossing, every patch of edible roots that could still be dug through frost. The air of the late Pleistocene carried far less moisture than ours, producing a constant static dryness that cracked skin and lips, turned wood brittle, and made fires harder to maintain. Yet this same dryness preserved bones, plants and pollen for us to study tens of millennia later. Nature's cruelty became archaeology's gift. When scientists reconstruct the thermal balance of the human body under these conditions, they find that even a few minutes of exposure without clothing or shelter could lead to frostbite. The body's response was instinctive. Blood flow restricted to core organs, peripheral tissues sacrificed for survival. Over generations, the individuals who tolerated this better, whose circulation favoured conservation, passed on traits that increased endurance. That is why, even today, populations adapted to ancestral cold environments show certain physiological patterns: more subcutaneous fat, shorter limbs, and slightly faster heat generation. These are echoes of that frozen world, still written in us. But what about altitude? In glacial times, atmospheric pressure and circulation patterns created regions with localized low oxygen. Some sites in Central Asia and Siberia show human occupation at elevations where the air was thin enough to challenge breathing. Their lungs adapted, their blood thickened, and their heart rates likely ran lower at rest. These traits mirror those seen today in high-altitude populations, not through genetic inheritance necessarily, but through similar pressures shaping physiology. Even in their silence, glaciers speak. They leave behind moraines, drumlins, and carved valleys, geological fingerprints that show where ice once ruled. The Mammoth Steppe stretched from Spain to Alaska, a nearly continuous ecosystem linking continents. It was here, in this vast corridor of cold, that human endurance evolved from a skill into a biology. The Ice Age did not just test humanity, it defined it. In the fossil record, we can see the results of that definition. The people of this world were compact yet powerful, their skeletons built like architecture, their spines supported constant bending, their joints resisted fracture even under extreme strain. It is not exaggeration to say that Earth itself trained them, not in months or years, but in entire lifetimes. The cold sculpted their lungs, the dryness their skin, the hunger their metabolism, and the endless horizon their patience. Yet despite all we've learned, the data only go so far. We know the oxygen content, the dust layers, the isotopic temperatures, but not the texture of the air, not the colour of the sunsets, not how silence felt on the tundra. Perhaps that is the humility this science demands, to know that the more we measure, the less we can feel what they felt. The Ice Age landscape remains both known and unknowable, a planet familiar yet alien, where humanity was not master but apprentice. The Earth we live on today is warmer, wetter, easier. But in the bones of our ancestors lies the memory of cold, a blueprint for survival written by the wind itself. We are not separate from that frozen world. We are its continuation, softened by time. And maybe that is the quiet truth the Ice Age still whispers, that strength is not the absence of hardship, but the art of adapting to it. What if I told you that the first machines of war were not made of metal, but of muscle and thought? Around 45,000 years ago, long before the first wheel or city, humans were already engineers of motion and death. Their inventions did not live in stone or fire, but in trajectory, in how a thrown object could turn distance into survival. They were the hunters who thought in traps, whose strength was matched by precision, whose intelligence was measured not in words or symbols, but in aim. Imagine a wide steppe under cold sunlight. Herds of reindeer and bison graze between low ridges, their bodies fat with the brief summer. Somewhere in the tall grass, hidden behind a slope, small groups of humans wait. They are silent. Their breath fogs in the air. What they carry is not random. Each spear, each blade, each shaped flake of stone represents hours of planning, testing, and remembering. They are not improvising. They are executing a design. And that, more than strength, is what made them unstoppable. The archaeological record from this period reveals that hunting had evolved far beyond the simple chase. Sites such as Kostenki on the Russian plain or Willendorf in Austria show carefully crafted projectile points of flint and bone, fine-tuned aerodynamic instruments. Some of these points are only a few centimetres long, light enough to fly far, yet sharp enough to pierce hide and bone. Experiments with replicas show that they could travel 30 metres or more when attached to lightweight shafts and thrown with spear throwers, devices that extended the human arm. The atlatl, as we later call it, may have been one of the first true extensions of the human body, a lever that stored energy and released it with devastating accuracy. But what makes these tools so remarkable is not their power, it's their consistency. Standardization implies foresight. When multiple artifacts share exact symmetry, identical dimensions and repeated patterns of flake removal, it means there was a blueprint in the mind before the tool was made. These hunters were not shaping stone by instinct. They were following designs learned, remembered, and perhaps even taught systematically. Each spear point was a small act of prediction, the understanding of aerodynamics without the word for it, of fracture mechanics without equations. To hunt large Ice Age mammals demanded this kind of thinking. A mammoth was not something you ran after. It was a moving fortress of flesh, 2 meters taller than an elephant and many times heavier. Even a single bison or wild horse could kill a human with one misstep. So the kill depended on strategy more than strength. Evidence from kill sites like Dolny Vestonis and Predmosti in Moravia shows patterns of bones arranged in ways that suggest controlled ambushes, perhaps using pits, barriers, or river banks to trap herds. Hunters seem to understand the terrain like living geometry, manipulating landscape features to their advantage. In this sense, thinking in traps was an early form of systems engineering. It required spatial memory, understanding of animal behaviour, and coordination between many individuals acting as one. Tracks preserved in ancient mud near Pavlov show multiple humans moving in parallel, converging toward a narrow ravine. They knew not only where the animals were, but where they would be. A mastery of prediction that turns a physical act into a cognitive one. Studies of stone tools from this era reveal microscopic wear patterns that match repeated use in butchery and hunting tasks. Some flakes show residue of animal fat and blood proteins. Others have tiny scratches consistent with hafting, being fitted into wooden handles or composite weapons. This suggests modularity, a level of tool complexity rarely seen in earlier times. A broken spear point was not trash. It could be resharpened, replaced and reused. The hunter's toolkit was not a collection of objects, but a system. One part failed, another compensated. Even more striking is how these designs appear across vast regions. From Western Europe to Central Asia, similar tool types appear within a few thousand years of each other. This doesn't necessarily mean direct contact between groups, but it does suggest a shared problem-solving logic, a convergence of minds facing the same challenges and arriving at comparable solutions. In evolutionary terms, this is called cultural parallelism. In human terms, it's something deeper, proof that knowledge could now travel faster than bodies. When researchers examine the physical marks on those tools, they can reconstruct gestures, the choreography of making, the rhythm of strikes, the angle of blows, the pressure of fingers holding a flake, all preserved in stone like a fossil of thought. Experiments with expert flint knappers show that even a simple blade requires hundreds of precise movements and an understanding of fracture planes invisible to the eye. These ancient hunters were performing microsurgeries on stone, turning mineral into muscle memory. It's easy to assume such intelligence was purely mechanical, but look closer and you see evidence of planning beyond the immediate. Hunters anticipated not just the animal's position, but the group's hunger, the season's weather, the next day's travel. They mapped cause and consequence before acting. In this way, the Ice Age landscape became a vast board of strategy, each decision calculated in risk and reward. Modern cognitive scientists sometimes refer to this as mental time travel, the ability to project outcomes forward in the mind. In the bones of these people, we see the body of strength. In their tools, we glimpse the mind of prediction. The question of cooperation naturally arises here, but even without discussing social behaviour, we can infer coordination through efficiency. One person could not take down a mammoth alone, nor process its meat before scavengers arrived. The design of their weapons hints at synchronized strikes, multiple projectiles hitting from different angles, maximizing confusion and minimizing danger. Studies of kill sites show bones split in consistent ways, suggesting practiced sequences of dismemberment. The precision of these cuts, visible under microscope, rivals modern butchers. Every motion was refined through repetition across generations. Another layer of sophistication lies in how these tools were adapted to specific prey. Long, narrow points suited reindeer and horse hunts, where penetration was key. Broader, leaf-shaped blades matched the anatomy of large herbivores with thick hides. Some spears were tipped with ivory or antler rather than stone, flexible enough to withstand impact without shattering. In every design, there's the same principle: knowing your environment, knowing your quarry, and knowing your own limits. Biomechanics research gives us further insight. When modern athletes replicate spear throwing using reconstructed Paleolithic weapons, their shoulder torque and muscle engagement show striking similarities to professional javelin throwers. The average Ice Age hunter, through lifelong practice, would have possessed not just brute strength but refined proprioception, an internal sense of where their limbs were in space. That level of coordination implies a brain wired for precision. Neural circuits linking vision, motion and prediction would have been constantly reinforced. In short, they were not just hunters, they were living ballistic computers. And yet, The genius of their traps went beyond the individual. Across Europe and Siberia, remnants of large-scale hunting structures have been found. Stone lines and pitfall systems designed to funnel animals. One famous example near 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 shows a lined post holes suggesting wooden fences stretching across the plain, guiding herds into killing zones. These constructions required not only muscle but geometry. To predict where a herd would flee is to think from another creature's perspective, an empathy of necessity, not compassion. They learned the patterns of animal movement so thoroughly that the hunt became choreography. In this cold, wind-scoured world, intelligence did not announce itself with speech or art. It showed itself in efficiency. A well-planned hunt could feed dozens of people for weeks. A mistake could mean starvation. The Ice Age rewarded foresight ruthlessly. Those who understood patterns, the arc of a spear, the migration of herds, the flow of air across a plain, left descendants. Those who didn't left bones. Modern experimental archaeology has given us glimpses of how advanced these systems were. When skilled flint knappers replicate Upper Paleolithic weaponry and use it in controlled hunts or tests, the results are astonishing. Spear throwers magnify human throwing force by up to 50%. Hafting adhesives made from birch tar or pine resin hold with tensile strength approaching that of modern glues. Even fire-hardened spear tips, once dismissed as primitive, perform with deadly efficiency when tested against animal carcasses. These were not crude tools. They were prototypes of applied physics, born from observation rather than theory. Such achievements force us to reconsider what technology means. It is not always metal or electricity. Sometimes it is the shaping of time and intention, turning the rhythm of muscle into repeatable precision. In the world of 45,000 years ago, technology was the thinking body itself. Every throw, every sharpened edge, was a form of calculation expressed in motion. We can see the outcome of that precision in the faunal record. Populations of certain prey species show sudden drops in local abundance during these centuries, likely from human predation. This doesn't imply overhunting in the modern sense, but it shows that humans had become ecological forces. They no longer reacted to their environment, they directed it. The line between adaptation and domination was beginning to blur. Still, when we handle those ancient tools in museum light, what strikes most scientists is their human scale. They fit comfortably in the hand, balanced, elegant, practical. You can feel the intelligence in the weight distribution, the careful tapering of edges. There is beauty in them, though not decorative beauty, functional grace. Each flake taken from the stone core was a decision, each curve the result of accumulated insight. We cannot know the names of the inventors, nor the moment someone first realized that a curved lever could send a spear farther. We only know that from this era onward, the hunt was no longer about brute pursuit, but about design. The strongest humans were also engineers of their own survival, translating observation into structure, instinct into mechanism. In that transformation lies the quiet genius of our species. The Ice Age forged bodies that could endure, but it was thought, practical, measurable thought, that made endurance meaningful. A spear is not just a weapon. It is an idea you can hold. What if warmth was humanity's first invention, not a tool of comfort, but of connection? Imagine the glow of firelight flickering against fir walls 45,000 years ago when the night outside could kill. Within a circle of stone, flame breathes quietly, painting faces in amber. The fire does not just heat the air, it draws the group together. It defines a centre. Around it, food is divided, stories of the hunt replayed in gesture and shadow, tools repaired, children observed and imitated. The hearth is not only survival, it is the first architecture of belonging. By the middle of the late Pleistocene, fire had long ceased to be a novelty. It was no longer the miracle of friction or lightning, but an instrument of rhythm. What changed now was scale and structure. Archaeological layers from sites like Dolny Vestonis in Moravia, Kostenki on the Russian steppe, and Abri-Patou in France reveal something remarkable. Organised hearth systems. These were not random patches of ash, but stable installations. Circular fire pits lined with stone, placed at specific distances within shelters or open camps. Charcoal analysis shows repeated use over generations, with fires relit in the same location season after season. The hearth became a fixed point around which human life revolved. What these ancient circles of charred earth tell us is that cooperation was not just social, it was thermodynamic. The physics of warmth dictated the physics of society. In freezing climates, a single fire could sustain multiple bodies through radiant heat if they were placed close enough but not too close. The exact spacing of survival. Studies of hearth placement in Ice Age dwellings show deliberate positioning to minimise smoke and maximise coverage. Archaeologists can even estimate how many individuals sat around a fire by mapping heat zones and discarded bones. The average seems to be about 10 to 12, a number small enough for mutual awareness, large enough for division of labour, in other words, a firelight society. At night, when temperatures fell below freezing, these groups relied not on walls but on bodies and embers. Charred bone fragments found in hearths suggest that, when wood ran short, they burned animal remains for fuel. Fat-rich marrow bones burned hot and long, and their residue can still be identified by microanalysis. This small act of innovation, turning refuse into energy, speaks volumes about adaptation. Fire was not just warmth, it was recycling, resource management, and cooperation made visible. Food sharing, too, is written in the ash. At Dolny Vestonis, isotopic residues from hearth sediment show a mix of animal fats and plant starches, evidence that cooking was a collective act. In one fire pit, remains of mammoth meat, fish bones, and charred seeds were found together, a menu requiring planning and timing. Cooking transformed more than food. It softened fibres, released calories, and made nutrients more accessible, supporting larger groups and longer lives. In doing so, it encouraged cooperation by necessity. No one could maintain a fire alone forever. The burden of keeping the flame alive became a shared responsibility, a daily exercise in trust, and perhaps that is the quiet genius of firelight. It demanded attention. Flames require constant feeding, tending, and judgment. Too much fuel and the smoke chokes the shelter, too little and the cold invades. Whoever kept the fire balanced held power, and power even then meant responsibility. In some camps, evidence suggests designated firekeepers, individuals who maintained embers through the night. Their vigilance ensured survival not just for themselves, but for everyone. Anthropologists studying burn patterns and ash layers note continuous combustion. The fires rarely went completely out. They were preserved, not reignited, passed like a living thread between days. In this sense, the hearth was humanity's first shared project. It replaced the unpredictable generosity of the hunt with the dependable cooperation of heat. Around it, hierarchies began to form, but not through dominance. Instead, they formed through competence. The ones who managed the flame, who understood how to dry wood, how to angle logs against wind, how to feed smoke away from sleeping infants. These people became quietly indispensable. Their knowledge was practical, not ceremonial, yet it carried weight. Fire was the teacher, and everyone learned by proximity. Archaeological reconstructions of Ice Age dwellings show interior organisation that echoes this logic. At sites in Moravia and Siberia, mammoth bone huts contain central hearths surrounded by distinct activity zones. Tool making on one side, food processing on another, sleeping spaces farther back. Such spatial order implies unwritten rules, fire-dictated movement, orientation, and even communication. The warm side became social, the shadowed corners private. When you sat in the light, you participated. When you stepped into the dark, you withdrew. In this quiet choreography of warmth, we glimpse the origins of structure, not architecture, but social geometry. Fire was a mirror. It reflected cooperation, intimacy, and vigilance. It demanded turn-taking. Someone adds fuel, someone stirs embers, someone cooks. In that rotation, we can imagine the rhythm of early human learning. Children watched hands manipulate flame and food. Skills were transmitted visually, audibly, thermally. Fire was both classroom and stage. Recent residue analyses from hearth floors tell us how tactile these environments were. Traces of ochre, bone dust and wood tar mingle with ash, signs of tool production alongside cooking. These were multi-use spaces, alive with overlapping tasks. Yet despite their density, they show order. Bones are stacked, tools arranged, debris cleared systematically. Fire imposed discipline. A disorderly hearth was a dangerous one. Sparks, smoke, or waste could threaten the group's safety. So the control of fire became the control of space, and perhaps of self. This interplay between flame and human pattern can even be seen at the microscopic level. In layers of ash preserved under ancient shelters, scientists identify alternating bands of black and grey, indicating different burning phases. Some layers are fine and uniform, slow, controlled fires for warmth. Others are coarse, rich in charcoal, quick, hot burns for cooking or light. The alternation suggests planning, knowing when to let the fire die and when to feed it. These small decisions created rhythm in otherwise timeless nights. There's an unspoken intimacy in such environments. Imagine the only light coming from a low fire, the only sound the crackle of wood, the occasional sigh of wind through hide walls. In that circle of glow, every face is visible, every movement noticed. Firelight has a way of slowing perception, of making the world smaller but sharper. Anthropologists argue that such sensory compression fostered empathy. When the world is reduced to the radius of warmth, awareness of others intensifies. You can't ignore someone shivering beside you. Survival depends on shared heat. But fire was more than a physical necessity. It was a timekeeper. Before clocks or calendars, flame marked duration. The slow collapse of wood into ember told people when to rest, when to rise, when to prepare for dawn. It turned time into something visible, a slow-burning reminder of mortality and continuity. Ash became the measure of a night survived. And in the morning, when someone stirred the embers back to life, it was a small act of resurrection. Controlled fire also expanded mobility. Hearths meant that humans could inhabit colder and darker regions for longer periods. With warmth secured, hunting parties could range farther, and shelters could become semi-permanent. This stability allowed for accumulation, not of possessions, but of memory. Each hearth was both a physical and emotional landmark, a place where experiences gathered. Returning to a familiar site meant returning to familiarity itself. Even in modern excavation, you can sense the persistence of these memories. The ash layers often contain fingerprints, impressions left in half-burnt clay or soft soot, a thumb pressed against a piece of bone charcoal, a child's palm outlined in grease and dust. These small traces are the human signatures of endurance. They tell us that for all our technological progress, our most ancient form of connection was not the screen or the word, it was shared warmth. Fire's role in shaping hierarchy is subtle but profound. In multi-hearth sites, some fires are larger, others smaller. The main hearth often lies at the centre, surrounded by secondary ones on the periphery. This may reflect differences in group function, the central fire for cooking and meeting, the smaller ones for individual families or sleeping clusters. From this pattern emerges the first division between collective and private space, the embryonic structure of community. Yet despite all our insights, we still know little about the emotional dimension of these spaces. Archaeology cannot tell us what they felt when they looked into the coals, or when someone shared a piece of roasted meat or reached forward to stoke the flame. We can only infer from our own experience that warmth draws people closer, that shared light dissolves isolation. It's reasonable to imagine that cooperation was not taught but felt, a physical relief from the cold that became emotional relief from solitude. When scientists measure the distribution of soot and ash in ancient shelters, they notice something poetic. The ceilings were blackened only directly above the hearth, not throughout the structure. This means smoke was managed, perhaps by adjusting entry openings or by aligning the shelter with prevailing winds. Fire had turned humans into environmental engineers, taming both flame and air. The lesson was simple but eternal. Mastery of one element requires respect for the others, and so, under those smoky ceilings, humanity changed again, not through evolution of bone, but through evolution of proximity. We became creatures of circles. The hearth defined the centre of our world, and everything else, hunting, making, resting, revolved around it. In its glow, we rehearsed the cooperation that would one day build villages, then cities. It's humbling to realise that our most enduring technologies, not metal, not writing, not electricity, are still patterned after fire. The campfire became the hearth became the household, and the household became civilization. But at its heart remains the same equation: warmth exchanged for vigilance, energy balanced by trust. What we can say for certain is that by 43,000 years ago, fire was no longer just a tool. It was a system, a social machine powered by care. Every flame that survived the night was proof that cooperation worked. And perhaps even now, when we gather around modern forms of light, we're still trying to recreate that first circle of safety in the dark. Imagine the world tightening, not with violence, but with cold. The rivers you once crossed freely are now silent corridors of ice. The winds that once brought spring now burn the skin raw. The animals you depend on drift south, chasing grass that no longer grows. Around 42,000 years ago, the planet's rhythm stumbled. The Ice Age, once steady in its breath, began to shudder. For the humans who had mastered predictable winters, it was no longer the cold that threatened them. It was the chaos. Climate scientists call this period a stadial, a brief, brutal collapse within an already cold world. The evidence lies frozen in the cores of Greenland's ice, where each layer of compacted snow is a calendar of Earth's temperature. In those cores, something happens around this time, a sudden drop in oxygen-isotope ratios, meaning temperatures plunged within a handful of centuries. Dust levels spike, suggesting that winds grew fierce and continents dried. It wasn't a slow drift toward glaciation, it was a sharp inhale, a planetary convulsion. For the people living on the mammoth steppes of Eurasia, that change was immediate. Permafrost thickened. Rivers froze longer each year. The lush grasslands that had sustained vast herds of herbivores began to fail. When the moisture cycle broke, lakes dried while snowstorms increased. A paradoxical landscape emerged. Too dry to feed plants, too cold to thaw, and too unstable for predictable hunting. The mammoth steppe, once the world's most productive ecosystem of large mammals, began to fragment into desert, tundra, and ice. We can still read this disruption in sediments and bones. In layers of low soil from Central Europe, pollen diversity collapses around this time. Grasses that had thrived in mild cold vanish, replaced by hardy shrubs and mosses. In caves, layers of soot alternate with sterile dust, showing that people burned wood one year and perhaps had none the next. Even in coastal refuges, shells reveal isotopic stress. Colder waters, shorter seasons, unpredictable tides. The planet's thermostat had broken. To understand how sudden it felt, imagine living by the signs of the world. The timing of bird migrations, the freeze of rivers, the bloom of spring plants. These signals were not folklore, they were calendars of survival. When they failed, time itself became unreliable. Hunters moved too soon or too late. Food caches spoiled. Children were born into seasons that no longer behaved. For a species that had evolved a remarkable strength for endurance, the problem now was rhythm. The strong could survive the cold. They could not survive its betrayal. What caused this climatic chaos was not a single event but a convergence of forces. Around this period, Earth's magnetic field weakened dramatically, a phenomenon known as the Lachant excursion. Cosmic radiation increased, disturbing atmospheric circulation. The result was a cascade of weather anomalies, shifts in jet streams, erratic precipitation, perhaps even auroras seen at mid-latitudes. At the same time, ice sheets across North America and Northern Europe advanced, altering ocean currents. The Atlantic's conveyor of warmth slowed. Temperatures dropped. In some regions, it may have fallen by as much as 10 degrees in only a few centuries. For modern humans, such a shift would be catastrophic even with technology. For Ice Age hunter-gatherers, it was the edge of endurance, yet the evidence suggests they didn't collapse, at least not immediately. Archaeological sites from this period show smaller hearths, thinner occupation layers, fewer artifacts, signs of temporary camps, of movement without settlement. Mobility became the last survival tool. When the world turned colder, only those who could still move had a chance. This mobility wasn't aimless wandering, it was strategic retreat. Paleo-environmental reconstructions show that as the North froze, life contracted toward refuges, pockets of stability along river valleys, coastlines, and southern plateaus. These microclimates, shielded from the full force of the stadial, became the last strongholds of warmth and food. Human groups followed the same path as the herds they hunted. The result was a pulsing pattern of population movement across continents. Expansions during brief thaws, contractions during freezes. Within these cycles, we can see adaptation at work. Animal bones from this time grow smaller, a sign of food stress in the ecosystem. Humans too show physiological responses, thicker bone growth rings, perhaps reflecting periods of malnutrition followed by recovery. Even the soot deposits in caves fluctuate, thick one decade, absent the next, recording the rhythm of presence and absence. These are not signs of defeat, but of resilience stretched thin. The ice tightened, but the species did not yet break. To modern eyes, an ice age may seem monotonous, endless snow and silence, but to those who lived it, it was alive with shifts. Winds reversed direction, storms followed no pattern, drought could exist beside blizzard. For hunters who had spent millennia mastering predictability, this new world rewrote every rule. The animals they tracked changed routes, their migration corridors splintered. Some species adapted by shrinking ranges or shifting diets. Others vanished from local records altogether. To survive, humans had to observe faster than the planet could change. One of the quiet tragedies of this era lies in the fossil record's silences. Entire regions show gaps in human presence for centuries. Sites that once echoed with life go cold. Hearths extinguished. Stone tools buried under layers of wind-blown dust. It's possible that some groups simply moved beyond our ability to find them, following retreating prey into lands now submerged or eroded. But it's also likely that others were lost, trapped by storms, starved by drought, erased by geography. Nature was performing a brutal experiment in selection, not of the fittest, but of the most adaptable. In the cores drilled from Greenland's ice, each millimetre of frozen water tells this story. Oxygen isotopes drop suddenly, signalling cooling. Layers grow dustier, showing that the winds carried silt from exposed continental shelves. Black bands of volcanic ash appear, brief but deadly, eruptions that may have deepened the chill by shading sunlight. The Earth was not one system then, but many small crises stacked atop one another, and yet through it all, fire remains. Tiny charcoal fragments in sediment tell us that wherever humans persisted, they carried flame with them. Fire became not just warmth, but continuity. During these unstable centuries, keeping a flame alive meant carrying memory through chaos. It allowed smaller groups to stay mobile while maintaining a link to their past camps. In caves that show repeated occupation, hearths reappear in the same spots, as if people returned again and again, trusting the ghosts of old warmth. Each layer of ash is a fingerprint of survival against the odds. Meanwhile, the ice itself kept advancing. Across northern Eurasia, glaciers expanded hundreds of kilometres southward, crushing forests, damming rivers, and redirecting entire drainage systems. The soundscape of the world must have been extraordinary. The groan of moving ice, the crash of calving walls into frozen lakes, the constant hiss of wind across open plains. To live there was to live within an atmosphere of noise and motion, yet also isolation. The horizon was vast, but every direction carried the same cold. Geochemists studying stalagmites and caves from this time period have found matching signals of drought in regions far from the glaciers, in what is now the Mediterranean and Western Asia. As the north froze, global circulation shifted, robbing lower latitudes of rain. Grasslands turned to dust. Even regions that had once served as refuges grew fragile. Humanity was being squeezed between ice and sand, forced into corridors of survival that narrowed with each passing generation. Yet somehow, life went on. The archaeological traces we have from this window, the hearths, the butchered bones, the occasional tool cache, tell us that even in the worst of it, people adapted locally. In drier regions, they exploited new food sources, fish trapped in frozen streams, marrow from scavenged carcasses, roots thawed from permafrost. In colder zones, they shifted their shelters closer to cliffs or built windbreaks from bones and hides. These are not grand inventions, but humble ones, the kind that make the difference between living and dying when the world loses balance. It is tempting to imagine despair, but the archaeological record suggests endurance instead. The absence of luxury items, the scarcity of ornaments, the focus on utility, all reflect societies focused on essentials. The ice had stripped the world down to its core mechanics, and humanity responded in kind. The species that once thrived through ingenuity now survived through discipline. Movement replaced comfort. Precision replaced abundance. What this period reveals about human adaptation is profound. Our ancestors were built for strength, but here they faced a test of flexibility. Evolution had sculpted their bodies for endurance in consistent cold. Thick bones, dense muscles, predictable metabolism. But chaos doesn't reward specialization. It punishes it. Those who could read the changing world fastest, who could alter routes, diets, and habits, became the new measure of survival. In this way, the ice tightened not only the landscape but the evolutionary funnel through which humanity would pass. We don't know how they felt when the first signs of collapse appeared, when the snow no longer melted at the right time, when familiar rivers froze too soon. Perhaps they read it as omen, or simply as misfortune. What we can infer from the evidence we hold in our hands is that they did not give up easily. They adjusted. They moved. They learned to live in the pause between freeze and thaw. And then, as abruptly as it began, the planet shifted again. The cores show temperatures rising just as sharply. A brief interstadial, a warming pulse lasting only centuries before the cold returned once more. For those who endured, the world must have seemed unstable, almost alive in its moods. Each generation faced a different Earth. The ice tightened, then loosened, then clenched again. There was no stability, no guarantee, only resilience. We can never fully feel what that must have been like. But every time we trace an ancient ash layer or analyse an isotope ratio, we touch the edges of that instability. It reminds us that the human story was never one of dominance over nature, but of surviving its unpredictability. The climate doesn't care for comfort. It only moves in rhythms we learn too late. And perhaps that is the truest measure of intelligence. Not how we shape the world, but how we endure when it reshapes itself around us. Imagine the world closing in. Valleys that once echoed with the sound of herds fall silent. Trails between hunting grounds vanish under snow. The rivers freeze earlier each year, cutting off migration routes before the animals return. Around 40,000 years ago, humanity's map began to shrink. Not the map drawn on parchment, but the one traced by footsteps and memory, the living geography of survival. For the first time in many generations, vast territories that had once supported humans became uninhabitable, or perhaps simply unreachable. The world did not end, but it grew smaller. Archaeologists see this contraction written in absence, in the empty layers of earth where hearths once glowed. Across the northern latitudes of Eurasia, from the plains of France to the Siberian tundra, entire regions go quiet in the archaeological record. Sites that once teemed with life and technology vanish for centuries. It is as if the northern half of the world exhaled and never drew breath again. The ice had not yet reached its full extent, but it no longer needed to. Isolation was the new danger. At this time, the human population across Eurasia was already thinly scattered, a mosaic of small groups bound by kinship and shared tools. But as climates hardened, these groups fragmented further. A valley that once held 200 people might now support 20. A hunting ground large enough for one band could no longer feed two. People began to cluster around environmental refuges, places where water still flowed, where wind was broken by cliffs, where herds still passed in predictable patterns. The rest of the landscape became wilderness again, not in the romantic sense, but in the original meaning, land without witnesses. This fragmentation can be seen in the stone. To live through such isolation required extraordinary resilience. Imagine the psychological landscape of a world where the nearest strangers are a month's journey away, where the horizon marks not adventure, but risk. Communication between groups likely became seasonal at best, dependent on unpredictable climate windows. In such conditions, knowledge that had once been exchanged, hunting strategies, tool-making innovations, even the locations of resources, may have become trapped within single communities. Cultural drift set in, not because people forgot, but because they could no longer meet to remember together. Some scholars describe this period as the beginning of micro-worlds. Small, self-contained human ecologies defined by their immediate surroundings. Each world had its own pace, its own methods, its own law. One valley might specialize in hunting reindeer, another in river fish, another in scavenging megafauna bones for marrow. The Ice Age turned humanity into a patchwork of experiments, each adapting in isolation. When we examine these variations, we're looking at different answers to the same question. How do you survive when the planet itself becomes unpredictable? Interestingly, even in isolation, creativity persisted. Bone and ivory tools from this era show remarkable local refinement. Needles with finely drilled eyes appear in some regions, suggesting improved clothing, an adaptation to worsening cold. Elsewhere, bladelets were crafted from scarce raw materials, evidence that even in resource scarcity, precision did not vanish. The will to refine remained. But refinement could no longer spread. Each invention was a voice lost in the wind, heard only within a single valley. Archaeologists also note changes in site placement. Earlier camps had often been positioned openly, near rivers or plains, maximising hunting visibility. Now settlements shifted toward protected zones, caves, rock shelters, or depressions shielded from the wind. This move toward concealment reflects both adaptation and caution. In a world of scarcity, visibility could be danger. The architecture of safety was redefining itself. One subtle marker of isolation lies in the disappearance of long-distance raw materials. In older layers, flint from distant quarries or shells from coastal regions often travelled hundreds of kilometres inland, proof of exchange or seasonal mobility. Around 40,000 years ago, that circulation nearly stops. Toolstone becomes local. The radius of movement shrinks to what a group can carry and return from safely. The world, once linked by paths and rivers, had folded into itself. To those living through it, the shrinking world would not have been abstract. It would have been felt in silence. Fewer voices around the fire, fewer footprints on the trail, fewer familiar faces at the seasonal hunting grounds. The social networks that had once buffered hardship through shared resources were breaking down. Anthropologists studying modern small populations note how group size affects survival. Below a certain threshold, every loss is exponential. A skilled toolmaker gone means not just fewer tools, but less teaching, less transmission, less resilience. The archaeological record of 40,000 years ago hints at that same spiral. Each absence compounded the next. Still, we know that people endured. Even in the thinnest years, there are traces of ingenuity. Burnt bone fuel continues to appear where wood vanished. Temporary shelters show repairs rather than abandonment. Some groups, perhaps recognizing the limits of their range, learn to cycle between a few stable locations, returning to familiar caves each generation. It was not migration in the grand sense, but a pattern of return, an ecological memory etched into the land. When we map these refuges today, a pattern emerges. The same regions that supported humans through this contraction, southern France, northern Italy, the Ukrainian plains, the Altai foothills, would later become centres of re-expansion when the climate eased. These were the cradles of continuity. They preserved not only genes but habits, technologies and ideas. Humanity's survival during these centuries depended on the persistence of these enclaves, pockets of stability in a world otherwise collapsing into cold and emptiness. It's worth pausing to consider the scale of loneliness this implies. We often imagine prehistory as crowded with tribes and migrations, but the numbers suggest otherwise. In the depths of the Ice Age, the entire population of Europe may have been fewer than a modern small town. The human experience then was intimate, repetitive, and uncertain. Each birth, Each hunt, each death mattered in a way we can barely imagine. Every decision could shift the balance between endurance and disappearance. And yet, even from such isolation, the species did not vanish. The record shows continuity, faint but unbroken, through all the worst climatic pulses. Wherever conditions allowed, fire returned, tools were sharpened, bones were carved. It is a reminder that humanity's strength was never only in numbers, but in persistence, the ability to hold on to knowledge even when the world withdraws its favour. When archaeologists walk those ancient valleys today, they sometimes find only a single hearth, a few stone flakes, and then silence for miles. But in that silence lies testimony that someone was here, briefly, during the coldest century of their age. Someone who still built, still hunted, still waited for warmth to return. The world shrank, but within that narrowing space humanity learned a new kind of strength. The endurance of the small group, the power of staying rather than expanding. In the end, the ice did not defeat them. It merely tested the boundaries of connection. And what survived those boundaries, the knowledge of fire, of craft, of shared endurance, would become the seed of all that followed. Isolation had pressed humanity to its edge, but on that edge, it discovered how much could still endure when everything else was stripped away. Imagine this. Twilight on a frozen plain 40,000 years ago. The wind has gone still. The air smells faintly of wood smoke, and two silhouettes move near the same line of trees. One stands broader, heavier in the shoulders, moving with deliberate weight. The other is leaner, taller, more fluid in stride. Their fires are close enough for the smoke to mingle, close enough that if either turns their head, they might glimpse the glow of another world entirely. This was the moment when two kinds of humans, both forged by survival, both aware, both capable, shared the same horizon. For most of prehistory, these two species had lived parallel lives. Neanderthals had ruled the western half of Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years, shaped by cold and scarcity into beings of extraordinary strength and endurance. The newcomers, early Homo sapiens, were recent arrivals from the south, the bearers of long-distance mobility and adaptable technology. Around 40,000 years ago, their paths converged, not in a single dramatic encounter, but as slow overlapping trails, overlapping territories, and eventually overlapping time. Archaeology gives us glimpses of this twilight, but never a clear picture. It is not a story of conquest or extinction, at least not yet, but of proximity. Caves across Europe from southern France to the Carpathians show alternating layers of occupation. In one layer, tools of Neanderthal craftsmanship, thick flakes, heavy scrapers, points suited for close-quarters hunting. Above it, a different signature, thinner blades, standardized shapes, delicate bone points. Sometimes the two appear in the same layer, separated by nothing but a few centimetres of ash. It is the archaeological equivalent of two voices singing the same note for a brief, fragile moment. At sites like Châtelperron in France and 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 in Italy, those two voices almost harmonise. The Neanderthal-made Châtelperronian industry shows tool types that resemble those of early Homo sapiens. Long blades, ivory ornaments, refined techniques. Some researchers see this as evidence of imitation or contact, others as parallel innovation. The truth is uncertain. What matters is that it happened in the same places, at the same time. The boundaries between the species, once clear in textbooks, blur in the firelight. To understand what these encounters might have looked like, we can look not for weapons, but for patterns of coexistence. Excavated animal bones tell part of the story. In caves where both species dwelled at different times, their prey overlaps: reindeer, horse, ibex, mammoth. Yet the butchering marks differ. Neanderthals often favoured shorter-range hunting, ambush strategies that required immense strength and coordination. Homo sapiens preferred distance, lighter projectiles, traps, and persistence hunts over greater terrain. When both occupied the same regions, they may have targeted different niches of the same ecosystem. Competition did not always mean conflict, it could also mean avoidance. The Ice Age landscape was vast, but the zones of abundance were few. Sharing space meant negotiating survival. We also see this negotiation in the geography of settlement. Neanderthal sites tend to cluster in sheltered valleys and caves, where windbreaks and animal migrations intersected. The newer Homo sapien sites often appear slightly higher or more open, near ridgelines or rivers, where movement was easier and hunting lines could be established. Some scientists have suggested that these patterns reflect different spatial preferences, one species rooted, the other ranging. It's possible that, at least for a time, they lived in awareness rather than in opposition. If you stood between those two fires and listened, the sounds might have been strangely similar. Both species chipped stone with practiced rhythm, cracked bones for marrow, whispered plans for the next hunt. Both tended fire through the night, both fed children from the same kind of roasted meat. But subtle differences reveal different minds. Neanderthals shaped the world to endure it. Homo sapiens reshaped the world to expand within it. That distinction is not superiority. It is simply strategy. The Neanderthals had mastered permanence, the sapiens adaptation. One of the most evocative sites of this overlap lies in the limestone caves of southwestern France. Grotte du Renne. There, archaeologists found layers filled with Neanderthal remains and objects that once seemed too advanced to belong to them. Pierced animal teeth, pigment-stained bones, decorated tools. For decades, debate raged. Had Neanderthals adopted these from contact with Homo sapiens, or had they invented them independently? Either answer is remarkable. If imitation, it shows curiosity. If invention, it shows parallel evolution of complexity. Either way, the image of the primitive Neanderthal dissolves. They were not brutish shadows, but thinkers at twilight. Contact between species is almost impossible to see directly, yet some faint footprints remain. At sites in Bulgaria, the Levant and the Italian peninsula, layers of occupation blend so closely that radiocarbon dating can barely separate them. These were frontier zones, places where groups likely met seasonally, whether to hunt the same herds, to scavenge the same carcasses, or to claim the same shelter. Did they communicate? Possibly. Did they exchange tools or food? Perhaps. Did they fear each other? Almost certainly. But fear and recognition are not opposites. They are both acknowledgements of the other's presence, a sign that two minds saw each other as real. When we compare the physical remains, we can almost see the reflection in flesh. Neanderthals were broader across the chest, shorter in limb, adapted to conserve heat. Homo sapiens, narrower and longer-limbed, were built for distance and endurance. Both species bore the marks of hardship, healed fractures, arthritis, tooth wear, but both lived long enough for those injuries to mend. That alone implies cooperation within their own groups. Whether they saw that same capacity in each other, we do not know, but they must have noticed the resemblance. Two intelligent beings, two kinds of firelight. The recognition would have been unavoidable. Some encounters might have been peaceful, others not. A resource-rich valley could support only so many. Archaeological sites in Central Europe show abrupt transitions where one species disappears and the other appears, sometimes with burned layers between. Conflict is plausible. Yet even in competition there is proximity. You can't fight what you can't find. These were not distant rivals, they were neighbours. The idea of two kinds of humans sharing one continent has long haunted our imagination, but the evidence paints a subtler picture. It was not a war, not a meeting of civilizations, but a slow and uneven interaction stretched across millennia. In some valleys, contact might have lasted generations. In others, it may have been no more than a fleeting encounter. The archaeological record captures this in fragments. A tool traded, a site reused, a fire reignited where another species once sat. We must resist the temptation to turn this into myth. There were no villains here, no chosen successors. Both were products of their environments, each exquisitely adapted to a world that was itself vanishing. When the climate shifted again, when forests gave way to tundra and herds changed their routes, both would feel the same pressure. But for a few thousand years they shared the same stage. The twilight of coexistence left more questions than answers. We can't yet trace language, but shared gestures seem inevitable. We can't know if they traded tools, but in the record we see convergence, and we can't measure emotion, but the evidence of care, of survival through harshness, suggests empathy was not exclusive to one kind of human. Perhaps that's what makes this moment so haunting. For a brief time, there were two ways of being human, both valid, both fragile, both aware. When modern excavators uncover these shared layers, it's easy to imagine that moment under the firelight, the air thick with smoke, the crack of flint echoing across stone, the faint outline of a figure watching from the shadows, uncertain whether to approach. The Ice Age was not quiet. It was full of eyes meeting in the dark, and when those fires finally went out, the land itself remembered. The alternating layers of ash and earth are not just sediment, they are dialogue, frozen mid-sentence. For a time, the world was large enough for both kinds of humanity, but the cold tightened again, and the map shrank once more, leaving only one voice to tell the story. Still, within the archaeological silence, there lingers the faint scent of shared smoke, proof that we were not alone when the world grew dim. What if I told you that the fate of our entire species once depended on a few hundred families? Imagine a winter so long that the world itself forgets how to recover, when entire valleys fall silent and human footprints vanish for centuries. Around 38,000 years ago, that silence wasn't just across the land. It was written into our DNA. What the fossils can't show, the genes remember. A moment when Homo sapiens, already scattered and thinly spread across Ice Age Eurasia, came dangerously close to disappearing. The ice was tightening, the environment collapsing into chaos, and the population of our species, the physically strongest humans ever to live, had become too small to guarantee its own continuity. Geneticists call this kind of event a bottleneck, a narrowing of diversity so extreme that random survival begins to shape the future more than natural selection does. It's not about the strongest or the smartest. It's about who happens to live through the night, who gives birth, who passes on their line. When a population shrinks, the dice of heredity start to roll louder. Each birth, each death, each accident leaves a proportionally larger mark on the entire species. The history of humanity at this point became a game of statistical luck. Genes in the frost, carried by fewer and fewer bodies through an increasingly unpredictable world. We can trace this not through tools or bones, but through the quiet arithmetic of mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down through maternal lines, unchanged except by the slow erosion of mutation. When scientists analyze these sequences from both ancient and modern remains, they see a striking pattern. Around 38,000 years ago, genetic diversity plummets. It's as if the family tree of humanity suddenly pruned itself, leaving only a few surviving branches to seed the millennia that followed. This wasn't a single catastrophe, but a cumulative one, the product of small, isolated groups living too far apart to exchange partners, languages, or genes. Each band of humans that endured the late Pleistocene was a world unto itself, maybe a few dozen individuals at most. Cousins, parents, children, elders. They hunted together, buried their dead together, and probably never saw another group for months, even years. Over time, these clans became islands of biology drifting through the cold. When numbers fall this low, something subtle begins to happen at the genetic level. Alleles, the variants of genes that make us different, start disappearing. Not because they're harmful, but because there are too few bodies left to carry them. The great diversity of early Homo sapiens, inherited from Africa's vast populations, was being sifted by chance into a handful of surviving combinations. You could think of it like language erosion. Imagine a language with 1,000 words spoken by millions. Now imagine it spoken by 20 people. Within a few generations, words vanish simply because no one remembers them. Genetic drift works the same way. The smaller the group, the faster the loss. Some traits persist, not because they're adaptive, but because they belong to those who happen to live long enough to reproduce. In the long run, this randomness can reshape the entire species. Evolution, in these moments, becomes not a sculptor, but a coin toss. Archaeology hints at how this genetic bottleneck looked from the ground. In sites dated to around this time, 38 to 36,000 years ago, we find evidence of sparse reoccupation, small hearths, and limited tool diversity. Fewer people meant fewer ideas, fewer innovations, and fewer teachers to pass on techniques. The sophistication of earlier Upper Paleolithic industries gives way to simpler, more regionally distinct traditions. These weren't declines in intelligence, but consequences of scale. Culture itself became subject to drift, much like genes. A tool type or hunting strategy that vanished in one valley could not easily be recovered from another, because the people there might never meet again. Esotopic studies of human bones from this period reveal nutritional stress, signatures of repeated starvation and migration. Even those who survived did so precariously, often by relying on the same limited resources season after season. Malnutrition doesn't just weaken bodies, it weakens reproductive success. Fewer births, more infant deaths, and shorter lifespans compound the genetic squeeze. Population models suggest that in some regions of Ice Age Europe, effective population size, meaning the number of individuals actively contributing to the gene pool, may have fallen to a few hundred. It's not that humanity disappeared, it's that it thinned into ghostly traces, too diffuse to see except through the lens of time. From a biological perspective, what happened next is almost miraculous. Despite isolation, small groups maintained enough connectivity to avoid full extinction. How they did so remains uncertain. Perhaps seasonal migrations intersected just enough for rare exchanges of mates and ideas. Perhaps shifting herds or rivers served as corridors linking refuges scattered across the continent. Or perhaps it was simply resilience, the stubborn adaptability of Homo sapiens, refusing to vanish no matter how small the world became. We can still detect these ancient crossroads in the genetic signatures left behind. Within the surviving lineages, mitochondrial data shows certain haplogroups, maternal lines, dominating across wide regions, suggesting that only a few families repopulated vast territories once conditions stabilized. It's a humbling thought that most modern humans share descent from a handful of Ice Age mothers whose descendants endured through chance and endurance rather than dominance, each one a statistical survivor of frost and famine. When we look at population models reconstructed from these data, a story of rhythm emerges, contraction and rebound, like breath in the lungs of the species. Every few millennia, as climates fluctuated, populations would collapse into refugia, small habitable zones in southern Europe, the Near East, or Central Asia, and then expand again when the cold receded. Each expansion carried forward only a fraction of the previous genetic variety. The more times this cycle repeated, the narrower the palette became. Humanity, once a tapestry of variation, became uniform by necessity. There is another, quieter cost to small numbers: vulnerability to chance itself. In large populations, random events, a drought, an epidemic, a flood, barely dent the gene pool, but in tiny ones, they can erase entire lineages overnight. A clan that loses its only childbearing female, or that faces one unlucky winter, can disappear forever. The archaeological gaps we find in the record, those silent centuries between layers, may reflect not migration, but this kind of invisible attrition. Randomness, not warfare, was the great reaper of prehistory. This concept of genetic drift often sounds abstract, but it's profoundly human. It means that the shape of your face, the colour of your skin, even the structure of your immune system might trace back not to grand adaptation, but to the accidents of survival during this bottleneck. We are, in a way, the sum of what didn't die. Evolution isn't always progress. Sometimes it's endurance written in probability. In this cold and narrowing world, the survivors likely felt the pressure in every aspect of life. Isolation magnifies identity. Small groups form tighter bonds, develop unique habits, and defend resources more fiercely. Anthropologists studying small foraging societies today note that when populations drop below a certain size, social networks collapse inward. Marriages become endogamous, innovation slows, and storytelling becomes the main vessel of continuity. The Ice Age survivors were not primitive. They were specialists in persistence. Every newborn was hope condensed. Every grave a reminder of statistical fragility. The environment itself amplified this fragility. The worsening stadials around this period brought violent swings, sudden thaws followed by deeper freezes. Game migrations became unpredictable. Glacial advance cut off once fertile valleys, forcing small groups into ever tighter corridors of survival. Some may have attempted to follow the retreating animals north, only to be trapped by the returning cold. Others stayed in refuges along river valleys, living on fish and stored roots. Whatever their strategy, the cost was the same: fewer choices, smaller ranges, narrower futures. And yet, through all this contraction, we find traces of persistence. Bone awls, carefully shaped blades, and repaired shelters appear in archaeological context even from the harshest millennia. These small acts of maintenance are acts of defiance. They show that culture, even in its simplest form, refused to vanish. Humans continued to teach, to make, to share. Survival wasn't just physical, it was informational. The continuity of memory, even within a few dozen minds, was enough to carry the lineage through. From a modern perspective, it's almost impossible to grasp how close our species came to vanishing. Geneticists estimate that the entire population of Homo sapiens in Eurasia during this period may have numbered in the low thousands, perhaps even less. To put that in context, we are descendants of a population smaller than a single modern village. The genetic imprint of that near loss still lingers in our DNA today, the faint echo of a frozen bottleneck that once squeezed us into endurance. And so, When we speak of survival in the Ice Age, we must remember that it wasn't just the body that persisted, but probability itself. Humanity did not outthink or overpower the climate. It simply lasted long enough for the dice to fall in its favour. The ice would continue to shift, the populations to rise and fall, but from this bottleneck emerged the foundation of all humans who would follow. The diversity we lost made us uniform. The chance we endured made us one. Perhaps that's the quiet legacy of those cold millennia, that survival is never guaranteed by strength alone. Sometimes it's a matter of being in the right valley when the snow stops, of one child living when another doesn't, of a fire staying lit through a single long night. From such accidents, the entire future unfolds. What if I told you that survival stopped belonging to the strongest? That somewhere around 36,000 years ago, the most powerful bodies in history began to vanish, not because they failed, but because the world no longer rewarded muscle. Imagine a time when the ice still ruled, when cold sculpted every bone and movement, but beneath the skull something quieter was happening, a rewiring. The same species that had once lifted mammoth bones and sprinted through snow began to survive instead by imagining what could not yet be seen. The future was becoming an idea, not an instinct. By this point in the late Pleistocene, the physical form of Homo sapiens had already begun to change. The robust skeletons of earlier humans, dense limbs, flared ribs, heavy musculature, were giving way to lighter frames and finer bones. The thick brow ridges and projecting faces of our ancestors softened, replaced by higher foreheads and rounder skulls. The changes were subtle in each generation, but unmistakable across time. What's most extraordinary, however, isn't what grew weaker, it's what grew busier. Inside those reshaped skulls, the architecture of the brain itself was shifting. Endocranial reconstructions of fossil skulls from around this period show a redistribution of brain volume. The total size didn't increase dramatically. It actually may have shrunk slightly from the enormous brains of earlier Homo lineages, but its organisation changed. The parietal regions, which handle spatial reasoning, tool manipulation, and abstract thinking, expanded relative to other areas. So did the prefrontal cortex, the seat of planning, social strategy, and self-control. In contrast, the parts of the brain dedicated to raw motor coordination and olfactory processing receded. Evolution wasn't making the brain bigger, it was making it more efficient. The ice had forced humanity to evolve not just endurance, but foresight. At the same time, the body was adjusting to a new energy economy. Muscle tissue, especially the type needed for explosive power, demands enormous caloric investment. Every pound of dense muscle requires a steady intake of protein and fat, something increasingly rare in the unstable climates of the late Ice Age. Neural tissue, on the other hand, is metabolically expensive but strategically efficient. A small brain can do little, but a complex one can predict, plan, and preserve. In evolutionary terms, it was as if the body had taken resources from the limbs and reinvested them in imagination. This trade-off wasn't deliberate, of course. It was survival through physiology. The humans who endured longest were not the strongest hunters, but those who could anticipate the movements of animals, track seasons, ration food, and remember routes. In the constant uncertainty of glacial Europe, brawn could no longer guarantee safety. The great bodies built for cold endurance began to fade, replaced by leaner, more cognitively agile forms. Fossil remains from sites like Dolní Věstony and Pavlov show this transition clearly. Smaller joints, narrower chests, and skulls with expanded cranial domes. The strongest humans in history were slowly giving way to the most adaptable. Paleoanthropologists studying energy budgets have noted something profound in this shift. The brain of a Homo sapiens consumes about 20% of the body's resting energy. far more than that of any other mammal. In times of abundance, this is manageable. In times of famine, it is costly. Yet the fact that our ancestors maintained such expensive organs during crisis means one thing: the payoff outweighed the price. Intelligence was no longer a luxury, it was an ecological necessity. The body became a delivery system for cognition. In the archaeological record, we can see the fingerprints of this change. Around this time, tool-making accelerates in complexity. Stone blades are standardized with remarkable precision, showing not brute carving but conceptual pre-planning, the mental ability to visualize a form before it exists. Composite tools, in which stone, bone, and adhesive are combined into a single implement, become widespread. That process demands abstract sequencing, to imagine materials not as they are, but as they might be when combined. Each spear, scraper, or point became a physical manifestation of thought, not just strength. The new kind of intelligence emerging then wasn't merely technical, it was relational. Social cognition, the ability to predict the behaviour of others, began to matter as much as predicting the weather. In small, fragile groups, survival depended on cooperation, negotiation, and empathy. The brain evolved not only to hunt, but to coexist. Enlarged parietal and frontal regions supported this, allowing early humans to model not just the physical world, but the emotional one. They began to understand intentions, alliances, and trust. Where muscles had once solved problems through force, minds began to solve them through subtlety. What's striking is that these changes didn't require a conscious choice. They emerged naturally through differential survival. Groups that cooperated and innovated could maintain stability through crisis. Those that relied on strength alone vanished with their prey. Evolution has no sentiment. It keeps what works. And in the unpredictable chaos of glacial climate, the ability to imagine alternatives was the new form of endurance. In a sense, this was when humanity's most defining trait, the capacity for simulation, took centre stage. The brain became a landscape of possibilities. It could rehearse hunts before they happened, weigh risks without taking them, or plan migrations across unseen territory. Cognitive scientists describe this as prospection, the ability to envision future scenarios. The fossils don't show imagination, but the artifacts do. Each carefully shaped tool or precisely chosen campsite is evidence of thought extended through time. One might wonder whether this trade-off had a cost beyond muscle. The robust humans of earlier millennia were adapted to direct struggle, a world of immediacy. When a predator approached or prey bolted, their reactions were instantaneous. The newer humans, lighter and more contemplative, lived more in the realm of anticipation than reaction. They began to delay gratification, to invest effort now for a result later. This shift, tiny at first, would ripple across millennia. It marked the beginning of human patience, the ability to suffer momentary loss for long-term gain. In the fossilized skulls from this period, we see subtle morphological cues: more globular brain cases, reduced jaws, smaller teeth. These are not trivial cosmetic changes. They speak to a reallocation of energy. A lighter skull allows more efficient locomotion and reduced metabolic load, freeing resources for neural tissue. Smaller teeth reflect dietary shifts, softer, cooked food that required less brute force. The human face itself was being domesticated, shaped by selection for cooperation over aggression. The warrior's jaw gave way to the negotiator's brow. This transformation in brain and body did not happen uniformly. Regional populations adapted differently depending on environment and resource availability. In some colder zones, strength still had survival value and robust forms persisted longer. But overall, A slow trend toward gracility, physical lightness, paired with cognitive density, can be seen across the continent. It's as if evolution itself was rebalancing the equation. Less body, more brain, fewer calories, more ideas. What we often call modernity in human behaviour, innovation, strategy, creativity, was not a sudden leap, but the cumulative outcome of this long biological investment. When energy became scarce, imagination became currency. The Ice Age didn't just shape landscapes, it sculpted minds that could think beyond them. And yet, there is humility in this story. Intelligence was not the triumph of superiority, but the adaptation of desperation. It arose from scarcity, from the need to find patterns in an unpredictable world. Every improvement in cognition came at a cost. Longer childhoods, greater vulnerability, dependence on learning rather than instinct. The same brain that could imagine tools could also imagine fear. Awareness widened, and with it came anxiety, caution, foresight. Consciousness was not a gift from comfort, but a burden of survival. When we examine this transition through fossils and modern physiology, we see the quiet logic of evolution's trade. More thought for less strength, more foresight for less certainty. The human body that emerged was no longer optimized for fighting the world, but for understanding it. That shift would define everything to come, from social cooperation to technology, from art to agriculture. Perhaps the most profound consequence of this change was time itself. Strength lives in the present. It acts. It reacts. Imagination lives in the future. It plans. It dreams. It hesitates. Somewhere in the frozen plains of 36,000 years ago, our ancestors crossed that invisible line. They became creatures no longer bound by what was, but by what might be. And if we look at our reflection today, frailer, slower, yet infinitely inventive, we are still the inheritors of that trade. The muscles we lost became thoughts. The power we surrendered became the ability to imagine everything, including our own limits. Evolution did not choose sides. It simply moved the battlefield from the body to the mind. Imagine this. Somewhere in a cave lit by the last firelight of a glacial evening, a human hand presses red ochre against cold stone. Not to mark a territory, not to count, but simply to leave a trace. The pattern doesn't feed anyone or trap prey. It means something, though no one alive can say what. Around 35,000 years ago, survival began to include something new. The urge to remember, to symbolize, to dream while awake. For the first time in human history, survival became story. Archaeologists call this the Upper Paleolithic revolution, but that phrase feels too sharp for what was in truth a slow blossoming of mind. Across Europe and parts of Africa, we start finding artifacts that speak not of hunting or building, but of reflection. Fragments of bone carved into flutes, stones etched with cross-hatched lines, tiny figurines shaped from mammoth ivory. These are the first whispers of imagination recorded in matter. They tell us that our ancestors were no longer just reacting to their world. They were beginning to represent it. At sites like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 and 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 in what is now Germany, archaeologists uncovered flutes made from the hollow wing bones of vultures and swans. These instruments date back to roughly 35,000 years ago, making them the oldest known musical devices in existence. The craftsmanship is astonishing. The holes are evenly spaced, the mouthpiece smoothed for comfort, and the tonal range deliberate. This wasn't idle play. It was structure, rhythm, and breath turned into art. A flute like that speaks of leisure, of cooperation, of someone having time to practice. It implies an environment where the mind had room to wander, At the same time, in faraway caves like Blombos in South Africa and later in Europe, pieces of ochre were engraved with deliberate geometric patterns, grids, chevrons, and parallel lines. They seem simple, but behind them lies abstraction. These markings are not depictions of animals or tools. They are ideas made visible. To scratch meaning into pigment requires a leap beyond the tangible. The realization that form itself can stand for thought. This is the foundation of symbolism, the moment when cognition became recursive, when humans began thinking about thinking. Around the same period, another kind of artifact emerges, the small rounded figurines we call Venus figures. Found across regions from France to Siberia, these carvings of female forms, often exaggerated in proportion, sometimes faceless, have sparked endless speculation. Their significance remains debated, but one thing is certain: they represent an unprecedented level of attention to emotion and identity. The sculptor wasn't just recording anatomy, they were exploring what the body meant. Whether it was fertility, beauty, memory, or something else entirely, these figures marked a turn inward. The mind was beginning to contemplate itself. What links these distant sites and different expressions is not geography, but psychology. Something fundamental was shifting in the human nervous system, a process anthropologists often describe as self-domestication. Just as early humans tamed wolves by favouring gentler individuals, evolution may have tamed us by selecting for empathy, patience, and cooperation. The physical record aligns with this. Faces became more gracile, aggression markers reduced, and social tolerance expanded. The appearance of art and ornamentation might be the side effect of that emotional softening. When the fight for dominance declined, space opened for creativity. The engraved bones, pigments, and figurines all suggest a nervous system capable of sustained attention, a mind that could hold an image, a memory, or an emotion long enough to reshape it. This ability is uniquely human. It requires what psychologists call working memory, the internal workspace of imagination. To carve a figure or compose a melody, one must visualize something that doesn't yet exist, and then make it real. That mental bridge between perception and projection may be the defining leap of our species. We can also see in these early symbolic objects the birth of emotional externalization, the first time feelings were expressed outside the body. Before language, before writing, there were scratches and songs. A carved pattern might encode belonging, a flute might calm a child, a figurine might comfort a grieving parent. These are not trivial gestures, they are the roots of culture. Through them, humans began to share not just tools or food, but inner states. The act of creating art may itself have shaped the brain that made it. Neuroimaging studies of modern humans show that rhythmic activity, repetition, and fine motor creativity engage the same circuits that regulate emotion and social bonding. When ancient humans carved or played, they weren't only representing their world, they were regulating it. Art became a form of self-stabilization, a way to cope with uncertainty. The Ice Age was brutal, unpredictable, and lonely. The ability to make beauty out of fear may have been our greatest adaptation. This period also marks the beginning of aesthetic awareness, the understanding that something can be valued simply because it moves us. There's no direct evolutionary advantage to symmetry in engraving or melody in sound, yet humans kept returning to them. Perhaps they found in these patterns a sense of order that nature could not always provide. The cold might take a life, but the song could restore meaning. At archaeological sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, fired clay figurines appear among hearths and living spaces. Some show fingerprints, still preserved from the hands that shaped them before the clay hardened in heat. Those fingerprints are among the most intimate traces of early humanity. They tell us not just what people made, but how they touched. Each ridge is a line of continuity from their nervous system to ours. The desire to leave a mark, to make something lasting, is perhaps the oldest dream of all. It is tempting to imagine these early artists as primitive, as if their world was simpler. But when we look closely at their artifacts, the opposite appears. To engrave ochre or carve ivory requires precision, patience, and foresight. To play music for pleasure requires trust, an audience, a shared rhythm, a safe moment where no one fears predators. Art was the byproduct of stability, but also the producer of it. Shared expression built cohesion. Rhythm became ritual before ritual had a name. What we begin to glimpse around 35,000 years ago is not just creativity, but tenderness. These early symbols were not tools of domination or survival. They were acts of connection. Every groove, note and curve suggests a mind aware of others. The first art may have been a kind of empathy training, a way of practicing perspective, seeing the world through another's eyes or imagining what cannot be seen at all. There's humility in acknowledging how little we understand about their meanings. The flutes could have been for ceremony or lullabies, the figurines for myth or mourning. But their existence at all tells us that the human mind had become capable of abstraction, the ability to think beyond the self, beyond the moment, beyond necessity. In that sense, every carved line is a neuron firing toward infinity. When archaeologists uncover these artifacts, they are not just finding evidence of culture. They're excavating the architecture of emotion. The ochre marks show sequence, the figurines show empathy, the instruments show shared rhythm. These are not survival tools in the old sense. They are survival strategies in the psychological sense. They help a species endure through meaning. It's possible that by 35,000 years ago, humans had begun to perceive time differently. The repetition of patterns, the rhythms of sound, the circular shapes of figurines, all suggest a new sensitivity to cycles. Life was no longer experienced purely as reaction to seasons, but as a story with continuity. A mark on a cave wall might outlast the maker, a song might be remembered by others. In this subtle realization that something can remain, begins the human relationship with eternity. When we think of the softer mind, it isn't weakness. It's the opposite of brittleness. The capacity to imagine beauty in hardship, to preserve memory in pigment, is resilience evolved to its most abstract form. The first dreams carved into stone and bone were humanity's way of saying, we were here, and we felt something. These objects, the ochre, the flutes, the figurines, were not tools for survival. They were expressions of consciousness trying to understand itself. Through them, the Ice Age gained a soul, and in their echoes, we can still hear the hum of continuity, that fragile, stubborn thread between survival and meaning that defines what it means to be human. What if extinction doesn't roar? It whispers, not through fire or famine, but through a fever no one could name. Imagine a world 34,000 years ago, silent but for the crunch of snow underfoot, where a cough in one tent could ripple through a lineage. We often picture the Ice Age as a landscape of predators and blizzards, yet its most dangerous hunters were invisible. Long before agriculture, before the first crowded villages, disease was already sculpting the story of humanity, one cell, one breath, one winter at a time. In the archaeological silence of this period, pathogens leave almost no trace. Bones tell stories of trauma, of strength and fracture, but not of fever. Still, molecular ghosts remain. In ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains and sediment cores, scientists have found remnants of viruses older than writing, endogenous retroviruses stitched into our own genome. These fragments are like genetic fossils of infections endured and survived. They tell us that long before city-made epidemics inevitable, small bands of Ice Age humans were already engaged in an endless microscopic war. The cold itself was both shield and trap. Freezing temperatures reduced insect-borne disease, but the same isolation that spared populations also weakened their immunity. Without exposure to diverse pathogens, immune systems could grow naive. When climate shifts or migrations reconnected distant groups, every meeting was an experiment in immunity. A single respiratory virus, perhaps mild in one population, could devastate another. Even a simple cold in the malnourished and exhausted could become lethal. The cold's other weapon was deprivation. The Ice Age diet, rich in meat and fat but often poor in plant matter, brought nutritional imbalances. One of the most insidious was vitamin D deficiency. As sunlight weakened under glacial skies and skin remained covered by fur and hide, the body's capacity to produce vitamin D dwindled. This vitamin isn't just for bone health, it regulates immune response, the ability to fight infection, and even mood. Deficiency could weaken resistance to tuberculosis-like infections or chronic inflammation, leaving even strong individuals vulnerable. The result? A quiet erosion of vitality. Fossil evidence and isotopic analyses suggest recurring stress markers in bones from this era, porotic hyperostosis and enamel hypoplasia, signs of repeated illness or malnutrition during childhood. These marks, etched into the skeleton like scars of survival, show that life in the Ice Age wasn't just physically demanding, it was immunologically precarious. Each winter was a biological bottleneck. Survival wasn't simply endurance against predators, it was the delicate balance between metabolism, nutrition, and infection. One of the most intriguing discoveries of recent years is that many of the immune system genes we carry today, those involved in inflammation and viral defense, originated in archaic humans who lived before us. Their persistence implies selective pressure. Survival favored those who could mount strong inflammatory responses against pathogens. But inflammation, while life-saving, also damages the body. Overactive immune systems can lead to autoimmunity, where the defense turns inward. In the cold, with limited food and constant physical stress, a fever could kill as effectively as frostbite. Strength, once humanity's defining feature, began to work against itself. We sometimes imagine early humans as immune to the diseases that afflict us now, as if viruses waited for civilization. But evidence suggests otherwise. Microbes evolve faster than any species. The same bacteria that today cause respiratory and gastrointestinal infections almost certainly haunted Ice Age camps. In animal bones found near ancient hearths, scientists have detected DNA traces of zoonotic pathogens, those capable of jumping from species to species. Living close to hunted carcasses, sharing caves with scavengers, and butchering in unsanitary cold meant exposure was constant. The difference was scale. In small populations, outbreaks didn't spread far, but their impact could erase entire clans. The Ice Age landscape was also a perfect incubator for parasites. Lice adapted to clothing, fleas followed wolves and humans alike, worms thrived in the guts of hunters living on raw or undercooked meat. The discovery of whipworm and roundworm eggs in prehistoric sediments shows that intestinal parasites were as old as fire. These infections didn't always kill, but they drained energy, worsened malnutrition and slowed recovery. The most dangerous disease isn't the one that kills outright, it's the one that makes you too weak to hunt. As the climate fluctuated, so did water sources. Melting permafrost released trapped organic matter, breeding bacterial contamination in stagnant pools. Those who drank from glacial meltwater might have ingested pathogens similar to ancient strains of Salmonella or Campylobacter. even small gastrointestinal infections, when paired with cold stress, could dehydrate and debilitate entire groups. Death by thirst, in a world of ice, may have been common. Perhaps most chilling is the idea that epidemics could occur even without cities. We think of pandemics as products of density, but density isn't only spatial, it can be temporal. In harsh winters, groups sought shelter in the same caves or valleys, returning year after year. Over generations, pathogens could linger in soil, animal remains, or even in the frozen breath of survivors. Imagine a cave where one winter's sickness lay dormant in the dust, waiting to be inhaled by the next generation seeking warmth there decades later. The ice didn't erase disease, it preserved it. Recent research on ancient viral genomes has revealed that even in prehistoric populations, selection pressures favoured those who carried certain immune alleles, particularly those protecting against RNA viruses. This means epidemics strong enough to shape evolution occurred long before recorded history. Every surviving lineage, every living human today carries genetic proof of ancient contagion. We are, in a sense, the descendants of the immunologically lucky. Yet the cost of these adaptations was not evenly distributed. Some traits that enhanced survival in one environment became liabilities in another. Genes that once heightened inflammation to fight infection might later increase susceptibility to chronic diseases when nutrition improved. Evolution doesn't predict comfort, it only rewards endurance. The immune system we inherit is a record of crisis management, not perfection. To imagine the emotional dimension of this is to enter a different kind of prehistory. There were no shamans yet, no rituals for healing, only observation and hope. A fever might have been seen as a spirit, a curse, or just the body's mysterious heat. A mother might watch a child grow pale and still without understanding why. There is evidence in the burial record of care, injured individuals who lived long enough to heal, suggesting compassion. But some of the dead likely vanished without ceremony, victims of invisible forces. In that silence, the foundations of empathy deepened. Illness may have taught humans tenderness before belief did. It's possible, too, that disease-shaped migration, groups weakened by recurring infections, may have moved to new territories seeking cleaner water, better prey, or simply distance from death. The geography of prehistory, the way populations spread, split and vanished, wasn't only driven by ice and hunger, but by microscopic predators. The unseen frontier of survival lay not in the tundra, but in the bloodstream. What makes this chapter of human evolution humbling is its scale of fragility. The strongest humans in history, those who could chase mammoths and endure frost, were still at the mercy of things too small to see. Power, it turned out, was biological, not moral. Muscles and weapons could not stop a virus. Even now, thousands of generations later, the same rule applies. Evolution doesn't eliminate vulnerability, it merely rearranges it. So when we speak of the fall of peak human, it wasn't only a story of climate or migration, it was also an invisible war, one that left no monuments, no fossils, only absences. The gaps between habitation sites, the sudden disappearance of tool traditions, the clusters of burials from the same decade, these may be the echoes of ancient epidemics. The ice whispered through every breath, testing not just our strength, but our ability to endure uncertainty. And perhaps that is the true inheritance of this time, not immunity, but humility. The recognition that even the most powerful body can be undone by a single invisible visitor. In a world ruled by ice, it was not the cold alone that decided who would live and who would fade. It was the unseen, the microscopic, the unspoken breath of extinction. Imagine this. A continent folding in on itself, rivers once wide and free now choked with ice, forests thinned to ghostly bones, valleys turned into narrow corridors of life. It is around 31,000 years before the present, and humanity's great sprawl across Eurasia has begun to contract. The ice is no longer a visitor at the horizon, it is the horizon. For every step north, the air sharpens, the land whitens, and the map of the possible shrinks. What remains are refuges, not territories. Valleys where the wind can't reach, slopes that face the low winter sun, caves warmed by the steady breath of fire. Here, the last strong populations endure, scattered and surrounded by silence. We call these places refugia, geological sanctuaries where climate, topography and chance conspired to keep the cold at bay. They were the final homes of the robust humans who had once dominated the plains, their bodies still built for endurance, but their world now reduced to fragments. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Balkans, and the sheltered basins of Central Asia, archaeological traces become sparse but distinct. Layers of soot in limestone caves, chipped stone flakes beneath rock overhangs, and butchered bones in permafrost soil. Each mark a record of survival, shrinking in real time. In the Iberian south, especially along the coastlines of what we now call Spain and Portugal, caves like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 and 𝐓𝐿⁄ hold the last echoes of Ice Age habitation. There, the sea's moderated temperatures provided a thin margin of safety. The Atlantic winds softened the frost, and the coastal plains still yielded shellfish, small deer, and migrating birds. Yet even in these refuges, the record speaks of scarcity. Tools become simpler, not because skill was lost, but because energy could no longer afford waste. The fine blades and ornaments of earlier generations give way to expedient scrapers and reworked flakes. Survival had become immediate again. To the east, the Balkan mountains offered another sanctuary. Caves in present-day Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece preserved layers of habitation through the coldest phases of the last glacial maximum. The geography here, a patchwork of valleys and karst plateaus, created microclimates where plants persisted and rivers remained unfrozen. Archaeological sites like 𝐓𝐿𝐏𝐾𝐒𝐒 hinted intermittent occupation, suggesting that small groups may have moved seasonally between high and low ground. They lived light, adaptive, and mobile, their footprints ephemeral in the geological record. Farther into Central Asia, in the Altai Mountains and the southern Siberian foothills, evidence tells of yet another frontier of survival. The terrain was harsh, but the geography offered shelter. Deep valleys shielded from wind, mineral springs that never froze, and cliffs that caught sunlight for precious hours each day. Here, caves like Denisova, long occupied by multiple human lineages, may have seen their final human visitors of this age. The lithic industries of this region suggest both continuity and desperation, reusing tools, reworking cores, stretching every resource to its limit. A people built for endurance now faced endurance itself as a form of slow extinction. When we map these refugia across the continent, a pattern emerges not of conquest, but of retreat. Populations that once ranged from the Black Sea to the Atlantic now existed as islands of life in an ocean of ice. The spaces between these islands, once migration corridors, had become impassable tundra or glacial desert. The fragmentation was not only geographical, but genetic and cultural. Isolation meant less exchange, less variation, and fewer opportunities for renewal. In some valleys, generations may have lived and died without ever meeting another group of their kind. The faunal record mirrors this contraction. Reindeer, bison, and mammoth herds retreated southward, often tracking the same valleys as humans. where animals went, people followed, but the chase was increasingly uneven. The energy cost of hunting grew higher as prey numbers dropped and migrations grew unpredictable. Every winter demanded calculation, stay and risk starvation, or move and risk freezing. The Ice Age no longer tested strength, it tested foresight. And foresight, though powerful, could not guarantee outcome. Climate data from ice cores and speleothems, the mineral formations in caves, show that around this time, Europe entered a phase of heightened volatility. Abrupt temperature swings of several degrees occurred within centuries, sometimes decades. For people living on the edge of subsistence, this meant chaos disguised as pattern. Rivers thawed early one year and never the next. Animal routes shifted, plants bloomed and vanished. Archaeologists see this in site stratigraphy, periods of intense activity followed by silence. The record breathes in and out like the lungs of a species struggling for air. One might imagine that in these refuges humans lived in constant motion, yet the evidence suggests a paradox. Movement decreased. Each band, once nomadic, now clung to the small territories it knew could sustain it, however briefly. Familiarity became security. The ice made explorers into settlers, but not in the agricultural sense. Settlement here meant simply staying long enough to know which rocks broke the wind. The modern instinct to belong, to attach to a place, may trace its roots to these forced intimacies with geography. There's another layer of meaning in this retreat. Anthropologists studying human behaviour under stress have observed a universal pattern. When external conditions worsen, social bonds tighten. In the archaeological record, this might appear as increased sharing of resources within groups, or communal hearths with multiple activity zones. Caves like La Gama and Cueva del Mirón in northern Spain show evidence of repeated occupation by small, tight-knit bands who use the same spaces across generations. Fire pits cluster near walls, perhaps for warmth, perhaps for familiarity. These were not temporary shelters, they were remembered places. Yet survival in refugia carried a price. Isolation breeds not only stability but stagnation. Innovation slows when populations shrink, genetic drift accelerates, and with it, the randomness of fate. A single winter of bad luck, an infection, a failed hunt, an avalanche, could erase an entire lineage. The archaeological silence that follows such disappearances is haunting. Whole tool traditions vanish without transition, suggesting that knowledge itself could die with the people who held it. Still, even in these narrowing worlds, humanity's spark persisted. Evidence from sites like Vale Boy in southern Portugal shows that some groups adapted their diets, exploiting marine resources with skill and ingenuity. In Central Europe, small hunting camps show specialization in reindeer or horse. These were not mere remnants, they were experiments in endurance. Every decision to stay, to dig deeper into the land's memory, was an act of defiance against extinction. If we zoom out and imagine the map of that world, it no longer resembles a continent of expansion, but of constellations, tiny lights of habitation scattered among the shadows of ice. Each light represents a community, a language, a set of memories, and when one goes out, it is gone forever. What we see in the archaeological record is not a single collapse, but a slow flickering. Some lights burned longer than others, depending on geography, fortune, or adaptation. But the pattern is clear. The circle of life was closing. For scientists reconstructing this period, the data come from fragments, stratified ash, broken tools, animal bones with cut marks. Radiocarbon dates cluster tightly in these refugee zones, confirming that while much of Europe emptied, a few pockets persisted. Yet even here, continuity wavers. Some sites show evidence of abandonment lasting centuries before brief reoccupation. It is as if humanity, reduced to embers, kept trying to reignite itself. What these last valleys represent, perhaps, is not only physical refuge but psychological one. To live when the world itself seems to be ending demands more than strength. It demands meaning. The people of the refugia, though unseen to us, likely carried stories of the warmth that once was, of ancestors who walked where now only wind moved. These myths, if they existed, would be humanity's first elegies, memories turned into survival tools. In the quiet of those valleys, between cold rock and warm fire, the human mind learned to endure loss by imagining continuity. When we look back at this moment, 31,000 years ago, we see not defeat but the limits of endurance pressed into shape. The strongest humans were not gone yet, but their horizon had narrowed to a few surviving landscapes, a handful of valleys holding out against a planetary winter. Strength had not disappeared, it had simply changed form. It was no longer measured in muscle or conquest, but in persistence. And though the ice would soon push harder, these valleys remind us that survival is not always about expansion. Sometimes it is about remembering how to stay alive long enough to be remembered at all. Imagine this. A cave floor where footprints still press faintly into hardened clay, a scattering of stone flakes beside a hearth filled with ash. Someone left this fire burning 30,000 years ago and never came back. The charcoal still holds the chemistry of breath and wood, the memory of a final night. What we call disappearance did not happen in a single moment. It happened in layers, in the slow cooling of the last camps, in the soft settling of dust over embers that no one stirred again. The ice kept the evidence, but not the story. Archaeologists approach this silence the way astronomers approach the edge of a dying star, not through what is seen, but through what stops appearing. At sites across Europe and Central Asia, the final occupation layers, those last few centimetres of sediment, mark the end of a chapter written in soot and bone. Caves, once alive with the rhythm of daily life, grinding, shaping, singing, begin to show a different signature. Fewer hearths, fewer tools, more wind-blown sediment. The pattern is unmistakable. The places that had echoed with humanity's presence fell still. In the Iberian Peninsula, once a refuge of warmth and life, this transition appears in the stratigraphy of sites like Gorham's Cave, La Gama, and El Mirón. In these places, radiocarbon dates begin to cluster and then fade. The sequence of fires narrows to a final horizon of charcoal, thin, almost tentative, before the cave floor becomes sterile. At first glance, this could look like chance. Perhaps they moved, perhaps they would return. But the sediment says otherwise. The charcoal stops, the bone fragments end. The layer of occupation seals beneath wind-blown dust, which only accumulates when a place is empty. The story repeats across the Balkans, the Italian peninsula, and the valleys of Central Europe. In each region, the last signs of habitation fall within the same narrow window of time, around 30,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries. To modern ears, centuries sound long, but in prehistory this is an instant. Within a few hundred generations, entire cultural traditions vanish from the record. The Auroniation, with its fine blades and carved ornaments, gives way to silence, and when culture reappears again in the archaeological record, it belongs to different hands. Dating this silence is not simple. Radiocarbon, the tool that has illuminated so much of our past, meets its limits here. The the calibration curve flattens around this period, a phenomenon known as the radiocarbon plateau. It means that samples separated by centuries can yield the same apparent age. The result is uncertainty layered upon absence. When an archaeologist holds a piece of charcoal in their hand, they cannot always say whether it marks the final night or one of the last winters. The precision dissolves just when the story demands clarity. To trace this boundary, scientists turn to indirect evidence. They measure the size of hearths, the density of artifacts, the distribution of animal remains. In early layers, hearths are large, tools abundant, bones numerous. In later layers, everything contracts. The hearths shrink, as if fewer hands gathered around them. Bones show less butchering, as if hunger replaced abundance. The stone flakes are smaller, suggesting material scarcity or reduced expertise. Then, abruptly, the signal stops. In a geological sense, extinction looks like nothing, and yet there are still whispers in the data. In some caves, the final layers contain not abandonment, but struggle. At La Madeleine in France and Pagliacci in Italy, traces of repeated reoccupation appear. Brief, desperate returns to old shelters during fleeting warm spells. It's as though people kept coming back to the memory of safety, even when the world no longer supported it. Each visit left a thinner trace until the caves themselves, once filled with a pulse of firelight and laughter, became nothing more than stone mouths inhaling cold air. Across Central Asia, a similar pattern unfolds. In the foothills of the Altai, sites that once showed dense human activity thin out until only a few fragments remain. A hearth here, a flake there. Then the sediment turns sterile, glacial dust blown across the steppe, sealing the last warmth beneath it. In the record of one site, the final charcoal particle is so small that it could have come from a single twig, a spark extinguished almost as soon as it was lit. This is how extinction looks in the fossil of behaviour, not a battle, but dwindling. The end of occupation in these regions coincides with one of the coldest phases of the last glacial period. Climate data from Greenland ice cores show a sharp drop in temperature around 30,000 years ago. This event, known as Heinrich Stadial III, brought extended drought to the south and expanded ice sheets across the north. The corridors that once linked refuges closed under snow and wind. Food webs fractured. For humans adapted to mobility, the world itself became immovable. Migration routes froze shut. The last valleys became traps. Archaeologists studying these late layers often describe a sense of melancholy in the data, though they'd never call it that in print. It's not the kind of melancholy born of sentiment, but of scale. The realization that a culture's entire memory can fit in a handful of charcoal grains. When radiocarbon ages overlap and contexts blur, the last certainty we can hold on to is this. Someone made the last fire and we do not know their name. At sites like Istoritz in France or Temnata in Bulgaria, the sediment above the final occupation is often pristine. No disturbance, no later intrusion. It's as if nature itself respected the boundary, closing the door gently. Then, for thousands of years, nothing. Only when warmer climates returned much later do new traces of life appear, left by descendants we cannot quite link to the ones before. Between the two horizons, the living and the reappearing, lies a gap that archaeology cannot fill. It is not absence of evidence, it is evidence of absence. This silence raises a question few scientists can fully answer. How do we define the end of a people? A final fire, a final tool, or the last shared memory? Cultures don't die overnight, they fade. The end of the robust Ice Age populations was not a single catastrophe, but a series of small forgettings. The day a path wasn't taken, a tradition wasn't taught, a word went unspoken. The archaeological record freezes that process mid-breath, giving us only the material residue of what was once experience. Even the most sophisticated methods struggle to pin down the last moments. Accelerator mass spectrometry can measure isotopes in a fragment of charcoal the size of a fingernail, but it cannot tell whether that charcoal burned in the presence of laughter or fear. Luminescence dating can reveal when sediments were last exposed to sunlight, but not who covered them. Science can map the contours of extinction, but not the texture of its silence. There's an eerie symmetry in this uncertainty. The same coal that killed them preserved them. In the caves of the Pyrenees and the valleys of Siberia, permafrost locked their traces in stasis. Every excavation becomes both an act of discovery and of disturbance. Each artifact freed from its tomb of dust is a piece of vanished warmth. To hold a tool that was last touched 30,000 years ago is to touch the echo of a pulse that stopped without witness. Some researchers, cautious of narrative, resist calling this an end at all. They see continuity through migration, adaptation, absorption. Perhaps somewhere, beyond the reach of ice, these lineages survived in smaller forms. Perhaps the last camps are only the last we've found. The evidence remains ambiguous, and in that ambiguity lies both frustration and beauty. Science thrives on uncertainty. It reminds us that the past is not a solved equation, but a landscape of probability. Still, for most known sites, the record converges toward the same quiet. Around 30,000 years ago, the fires that once dotted the valleys and mountains of Ice Age Eurasia went out. The archaeological pulse, the heartbeat of stone, bone and ash, flatlined. The next horizon in the sediment belongs to others. So, how do we date the moment when no one came back? We cannot. We can only measure the interval between presence and silence, between warmth and dust. The rest is interpretation, the domain where science meets humility. The last camps went cold not with a cry, but with a sigh too faint to survive in stone. And perhaps that is what the earth remembers best, not our triumphs, but the temperature of our absence. What if survival was never about perfection, but about learning how to bend without breaking? What if the fall of the strongest humans, the ones whose bones could bear the weight of mammoths, and whose lungs could drink the Ice Age air, wasn't a failure at all, but the price of becoming something else? Around 30,000 years ago, the world tested our limits, and the verdict wasn't strength, it was adaptability. Every fossil left behind, every hearth turned to ash, every vanished lineage reminds us that evolution's masterpiece was never the perfect body, but the mind that could endure imperfection. The humans who vanished at the edge of the ice were not defeated by weakness, they were defeated by change. The cold shifted faster than muscle could evolve, faster than strength could compensate. But in that collapse lies a quiet truth. Those who survived were not the strongest or the bravest. They were the most flexible. They adapted by imagining new ways to live, by turning from power toward cooperation, from isolation toward connection. The story of peak human isn't about loss, it's about transformation. When we look at the skeletal remains of those late Pleistocene people, we see bodies built for endurance. Wide chests, thick bones, dense muscles, anatomical marvels sculpted by cold and scarcity. But we also see the limits of specialization. Evolution had refined them for a world that no longer existed. When the climate lurched, when prey routes vanished and seasons fractured, biology couldn't pivot fast enough. The survivors weren't those best fitted for yesterday's world, but those who could imagine tomorrow's. The same brain that once painted mammoths on cave walls would soon paint entirely new futures. The late Ice Age, then, was less a catastrophe than a crucible. It burned away certainty, testing every trait we thought made us invincible. And what emerged was not a stronger human, but a humbler one who understood that mastery of nature was an illusion. Strength, it turns out, is transient. Flexibility endures. Cooperation outlasts conquest. The lesson of 30,000 years ago still stands. Survival belongs to those who can learn, not to those who can dominate. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine those Ice Age hunters as our peak form, hardier, purer, closer to nature. But the truth is more complex. Their disappearance doesn't mean they failed. It means evolution moved on. Each adaptation, each extinction, each lineage that faded away is part of a longer conversation between life and environment. In that conversation, strength speaks loudly but briefly. Flexibility whispers, but never stops speaking. When we trace the fossil record, we find this pattern over and over. Species that over-specialize, those perfectly tuned to a single climate, prey, or behavior, often vanish when the world shifts. Species that improvise persist. In this sense, the so-called fall of peak human is not a tragedy, but a pivot in life's long experiment. From their disappearance came the rise of new kinds of humans, ones with softer bodies but sharper minds, slower tempers but faster imaginations. Evolution was not punishing perfection, it was correcting overconfidence. Archaeology reveals that even as the last strong populations withdrew into their refuges, others were already spreading, experimenting with new tools, new materials, new forms of social life. Their bones are lighter, their faces rounder, their tools more varied. These are signs not of decline but of diversification. The human lineage was branching again, turning adaptation into creativity. The cold had forced imagination to replace instinct. If we listen carefully to what the evidence tells us, the story becomes philosophical. Strength, as we once defined it, was a closed system. Muscle, speed, endurance. But real survival depends on open systems, on communication, empathy, and the ability to predict and share. The campfire replaced the spear as humanity's greatest weapon, not because it killed, but because it gathered. The same fire that hardened wood for hunting also softened minds for understanding. In evolutionary terms, cooperation is one of the most powerful adaptations ever discovered. From microbial colonies to primate troops, life has always rewarded systems that share. Humans simply pushed it further. The Ice Age was an amplifier. It turned competition into extinction and collaboration into continuity. The most enduring human advantage was not the arm, but the group, the network of minds that could think together. The fossils we dig up today are not just bones, they're records of decisions. Every stone flake, every charred bone fragment, every abandoned tool tells us something about what worked and what didn't. What worked, over time, were not the traits of dominance or violence, but the traits of communication and care. In the last refugees of the cold, we find evidence of shared fires, of wounded individuals cared for, of children raised through famine. Empathy itself became an evolutionary force. So perhaps what the fall of peak human truly represents is the birth of humanity as we now know it, not in the anatomical sense, but in the cognitive and emotional one. When the body reached its limit, the mind expanded to compensate. When strength failed, story began. From the ashes of the last robust populations rose the consciousness that would eventually write, build, and dream. Even now, traces of those ancient adaptations shape us. The genes that regulate our metabolism, our stress responses, our immune systems, all bear the signatures of that frozen world. We carry within us both the resilience and the vulnerability of those who came before. Every heartbeat, every breath at altitude, Every burst of endurance on a cold morning is a quiet inheritance from the ice. The fossils under our feet are not strangers. They're earlier versions of us, each one a chapter in the same long experiment called survival. There is something profoundly human about their ending. No epic battle, no single moment of collapse, just the gradual fading of warmth in a world too vast to care. And yet, from that silence came continuity. The disappearance made room for us, not as an improvement, but as a continuation. Evolution doesn't deal in justice, it deals in possibility. The gift they left us was not their strength, but their lesson. Perfection is brittle. Only change endures. When scientists hold those ancient bones, they do not just weigh calcium, they weigh time. They feel in their hands the fragility of form, the impermanence of adaptation. Each fossil is a conversation with humility. We often think of evolution as progress, but it's really persistence through uncertainty. The humans of the Ice Age taught us that survival has nothing to do with being the fittest in a single moment, and everything to do with staying open to the next one. If you think about it, that same logic governs our species today. We still mistake strength for security, whether in our bodies, our technologies, or our societies. But the fossil record quietly disagrees. The real constant in history isn't power, it's adaptation. From the first controlled fire to the digital glow of our screens, survival has always meant learning to live in new climates, literal or metaphorical. The Ice Age may have ended, but the test it posed never did. And perhaps that's the most haunting comfort of all. The story of peak human didn't end in extinction. It lives in us as both warning and inheritance. We're still writing the continuation of that fragile thread that stretched through the ice. Every innovation we make, every mistake we learn from, every act of kindness we extend is a survival mechanism older than we remember. The same flexibility that once kept a small band of humans alive in a frozen valley now keeps 8 billion of us navigating a different kind of storm. So, when we speak of the strongest humans, perhaps we should not picture hunters chasing mammoths or mussels forged in frost, but rather those who could keep hope alive in darkness, who could imagine warmth before it returned. They were not gods of endurance, they were poets of adaptation. Their strength was never in what they built, but in what they became. And as we sift through their ashes, measure their bones, and piece together the timeline of their fading, we're not just studying history, we're studying ourselves. Every extinction is also a mirror. What we see in it is not failure, but perspective. That strength without flexibility breaks, but fragility with imagination survives. The ice receded, the fires went out, but the story continued, not because we were the strongest, but because we learned how to change, and that perhaps is the quiet triumph of our kind. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.